Today's special episode of Cold Case Detective is a compilation of 28 cases we have covered over the last 24 months, spanning the entire globe from the present day to the distant past, each one a mystery we hope can one day be solved. Thank you for all your support over the past 2 years as we continue to move forward into the future on our mission to shed light on forgotten cold cases. Stay alert, stay safe, and settle in for this very special 4-hour episode of Cold Case Detective. But first, I'd like to thank Yours app for sponsoring today's episode. Concentration is absolutely vital to unlocking your best performance on a daily basis, while managing the heavy workload life often brings. For us, our minds must be meticulous and our focus sharp to release the amount of content we feature on Cold Case Detective and our whole family of channels, while staying on top of our personal lives too. You've probably joined us on the same journey, trying to figure out how to stay refreshed, lively, and productive without letting your brain go to mush. Luckily, our partnership with Yours app delivers pristine self-care and mindfulness, and it's only a few clicks away. Yours app is the fastest growing, most comprehensive and bang-for-your-buck personal wellness application on the market, featuring yoga classes, meditation guides, sleep studies, breathing clocks, and tons of advice from reputable psychology experts. It is proven to help you sleep better and fuller, reduce stress and anxiety, and take control of your mind so you can improve your emotional, physical, and mental health. It utilizes the latest AI technology to give you a personalized feel to the app, as well as beginner-friendly controls no matter your experience with wellness apps. It's available on both iOS and Android devices, and features freemium content, so even if you can't pay a cent, there are things to explore regardless. Yours app also holds plenty of content for both children and parents alike, including industry-leading themes for LGBTQ+ identifying communities. To join in on the fun, just go to yoursapp.com/cold to get a massive 60% off from the yearly Yours app subscription using the code COLD. Again, that's yoursapp.com/cold and the same COLD code upon checkout for your premium coupon. And now let's dive in with today's mysteries. Brian McDermott. Brian Douglas McDermott was a 10-year-old schoolboy who went missing from Belfast in 1973. Described as a quiet child, Brian was the youngest of 3 sons and 2 daughters born to Edward and Joan McDermott. Around 1 p.m. on September 2nd, 1973, Brian left his home on Wells Street in Lower Woodstock Road to play with his friends at the park. He was due home for Sunday lunch at 2:30 p.m, but he never arrived. Brian's worried parents immediately called authorities, who gathered a search party to look for the missing boy. The surrounding areas were meticulously combed through, derelict buildings were searched, and the Tullymore Forest Park was investigated, but no trace of the 10-year-old could be found. Then, a week later, on Saturday, September 8th, during searches of the River Lagan, the water was lowered so that the police could have a closer look. What they found upon draining the water was a parent's worst nightmare: a sack containing the dismembered body of parts of Brian McDermott. 1 arm and 2 legs were missing, and these limbs have never been recovered, despite investigators' desperate attempts to locate them. The body was also burned, leading authorities to suspect that after the slaying, the perpetrator had attempted to disguise Brian's true identity by burning his flesh. Local parents feared for the safety of their children, terrified that a killer walked among them, while the McDermott family fell to pieces and began to grieve for their lost child and brother. Brian was laid to rest on September 13th, 1973. While thousands of interviews were carried out, tips were thoroughly investigated, and a huge manhunt for the culprit was carried out, the police felt like they were running out of leads. They reportedly looked for sectarian links, paedophile rings, and witchcraft theories, but none of them turned up any promising leads. They also briefly considered links to the Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast. This was due to the idea in 1982 that Brian's case concerned, quote, possible homosexual aspects. The home was the scene of numerous serious sexual abuse allegations, which led to a massive scandal and attempted cover-up in 1980. There were even rumours about state collusion and whisperings that a paedophile ring was operating from inside the home, which had links to intelligence services. However, there has never been any established connection between Brian's case and the boys' home. The authorities also looked into 16-year-old William McDermott, Brian's older brother. They had suspected that perhaps he had taken childish revenge on his younger sibling after Brian had hit him in the back with a stick. The police had had their eye on him for a while, but it wasn't until 1976 that they were able to pull him in for questioning, when his mother reported him for beating her. William did confess during questioning, but quickly recanted this admission of guilt, and ever since he has maintained his innocence and claimed that the confession was coerced. Then, in 2008, his ex-wife told a court in Worcester that he had admitted to ending Brian's life. This was heard during a hearing over William sending his ex-wife threatening and abusive texts. William has other convictions for violent offences, but continues to maintain his innocence. Brian's older brother, Eddie, who was 19 at the time of his disappearance, has acted as the family's spokesman over the years. He has publicly stated that the family are estranged from William, having cut ties with him long ago. Eddie, in particular, believes that William is guilty of what happened to Brian in September of 1973, claiming that he grew suspicious when William said that he didn't want a book published about Brian's case when a writer approached the family in 2003. He even went so far as to contact his local MP, asking for him to put a stop to it. According to Eddie, William began to deteriorate after this, growing more aggressive and dangerous. In 1993, the Irish newspaper The Sunday Life received an anonymous letter and drawing of a suspect in connection with the case. The letter claimed the man in the drawing lived close to where Brian went missing, and even provided an address. However, nothing else seems to have come of this lead. Brian's case went largely under the radar in the 1970s due to the Troubles in Ireland. Even now, information on the case is sparse. In 2003, it was noted that the police still refused to rule out any potential connections to both witchcraft or paedophilia. After the unjust slaying of Brian, his parents turned to drink, and the family spent most of their days on the edge of breakdowns. Joan McDermott believed her son William was involved, right up until her death in 2004. The case of Brian McDermott continues to go unsolved. Anyone with any information on Brian's case should contact Crime Stoppers at 0800 555 111. Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw. On August 4th, 1971, two best friends, Rhonda Renee Johnson, who preferred to go by her middle name and was 14 years old, and Sharon Lynn Shaw, who was 13, spent the afternoon at the Galveston Bay Beach in Texas. A friend of theirs, Glenda Willis, told the Houston Chronicle in 2015 that the girls planned to go to the Wicks Water Ski School that day, but the wind had made the bayou too rough for water skiing. When she saw them at the beach and was ready to go home, she offered them a lift, but the girls declined. Witnesses last placed the girls walking on Sewell Boulevard in Galveston, but Renee and Sharon never returned home. On January 3rd, 1972, two boys fishing in Clear Lake found a human skull floating in the water. The pair thought at first it was a sports ball, but soon found out that that wasn't the case. 6 weeks later, searchers found the rest of the body and that of another in the marshes near the water. In February of 1972, the skull's teeth were compared to the dental records of Sharon Shaw, who'd gone missing 6 months prior. Sharon's crucifix necklace was found wrapped around the skull. The body was positively identified as that of the 13-year-old girl. The other set of remains found were later identified as Renee's, but the bodies of both girls were too badly decomposed to determine a cause of death. A few months later, in May of 1972, authorities received a tip from a man named Glenn Price, who was a local city councilman. He advised that the police look into a sex offender named Michael Lloyd Self, who worked at a gas station and had been guilty of several Peeping Tom incidents. It didn't take long for the police to look into this tip, and they visited Michael at his workplace. They asked him to come down to the station for questioning, and the next day, Michael arrived voluntarily, ready to answer the inquiries that the law enforcement may have for him. When asked if he knew the girls, Michael admitted that he did recognize them, but said he didn't know them. After this, however, things changed. According to Michael's story, Chief Michael Morris held him in confinement for hours, telling him he couldn't leave unless he confessed. He claimed that he was held up against a wall, hit with a nightstick, and taunted by Chief Morris with his pistol. Morris threatened to kill Michael if he didn't confess to the murders. Worn down and terrified, Michael agreed to confess. He was reportedly forced to handwrite his confession and then made to rewrite it several times. Later on, an investigator named Dave Coburn would corroborate Michael's story that he was coerced into writing the confession. Coburn even wanted to be a witness at Michael's trial, but he was never called. Coburn had seen Police Chief Morris treat another suspect in this exact same manner a year prior to the tragic case of Renee Johnson and Sharon Shaw. The final signed confession produced by Michael contains several discrepancies. He claimed that he dumped the bodies of the girls in El Lago, over 20 miles from the marshlands where the remains were found. He also said that he had strangled both, but neither showed signs of strangulation during the coroner's inquest. 3 days later, he provided still more conflicting stories, telling 2 deputy sheriffs that he'd picked the girls up from a Sizzler steakhouse, driven around an El Lago neighborhood with them, and then gotten food with them at a local Jack-in-the-Box restaurant. After this, he claimed he struck both girls over the head with a glass Coca-Cola bottle before stripping them of their clothing and throwing it onto the highway, despite the fact that both girls were found with their clothing. There were also witnesses who claimed to have seen the girls in Galveston around 9 p.m. on the night they disappeared, while Michael claimed that at that time, the girls were in his car with him. 2 weeks later, Michael Self was checked out of jail by sheriff's deputies and driven to the locations he mentioned in his written confession. The deputies took photos of him in each location, and these photos were later presented in court during his trial as a third confession, while Michael's lawyer rebutted this, claiming that what they'd done was illegal. Michael's trial began on May 15, 1973, and finished on September 18, 1974. He was convicted for the first-degree murder of Sharon Shaw, but was not convicted for the slaying of Renee Johnson. He was sentenced to life in prison. Over the years, Michael continuously tried to appeal the court's decision until he had no appeals left. He was refused each and every time, even after it came to light that Chief Morris and Deputy Tommy Deal had been involved in a string of robberies that had begun in 1972. The pair were arrested, with Morris being sentenced to 55 years and Deal being sentenced to 30. Although for many it seemed reasonable to investigate whether a thorough job had been done in regards to Sharon and Renee's cases, Michael's appeals and attempts at parole were continuously denied. Michael Self died in prison from cancer in 2000. An article from the Houston Chronicle in 2011 noted that Michael's lawyer had stated his belief that his client was wrongly accused and coerced into a false confession. 2 investigating officers, one Galveston police officer and a former prosecutor for Harris County, also share this belief. Since the untimely demise of both Renee Johnson and Sharon Shaw, there have been multiple other possible suspects beyond Michael Self. In April of 1890, an unidentified man in Taylor Lake, Texas, walked into his local police department and claimed to have committed the crime. During his confession, he allegedly admitted that he had tied both of them down with an electrical cord. This was something the police knew about, but had never made public, so they could distinguish the real killer from the false confessions. The man reportedly suffered from psychosis, and for some reason, despite the details he had given, he was later dismissed as a suspect by police. Then, in 1998, a man named Edward Harold Bell wrote multiple letters to prosecutors in Galveston and Harris County, confessing to the slayings of several young girls, some as young as 12, between 1971 and 1977, in the Galveston, Clear Lake, Dickinson, Houston, and Alvin areas. At the time, Bell was serving a 70-year sentence for the cold-blooded killing of an ex-Marine named Larry Dickens in Pasadena, 1978, whom he had shot dead when the man had tried to stop him from publicly masturbating in front of a group of teenage girls. Bell had gone on the run for 14 years, but was eventually located in 1993 in Panama, living with a teenage girl. In August of 2015, Bell admitted to taking the lives of 11 young women. He chillingly named them the 11 that went to heaven. He then went on to claim that he'd been brainwashed and forced to execute the girls by a secret organization. He died, age 82, on April 20th, 2019, and his potential involvement with the deaths of Sharon Shaw and Renee Johnson is still being investigated. With all the unexplored options and coerced confessions, it is unlikely if we'll ever truly know what happened on that tragic day of August 4th, 1971, to the two best friends, Rhonda Johnson and Sharon Shaw. George Smith IV. Born October 3rd, 1978, George Allen Smith IV was 26 years old when he went missing while on a cruise ship in the summer of 2005 during his honeymoon. On June 25th, 2005, George married 25-year-old Jennifer Hagel at a cliffside wedding in Newport, Rhode Island, which his sister Bree described as a storybook ceremony. George was set to take over his father's liquor store business upon his return to the US. His new wife, Jennifer, had recently completed a master's degree in education at the Roger Williams University in Rhode Island and was going to start a new job teaching third-grade children after the summer. 4 days later, on June 29th, the couple boarded the Royal Caribbean cruise ship, the MS Brilliance of the Seas, ready for their 2-week honeymoon, which would take them around several Mediterranean countries, including Italy, Greece, and Turkey. The pair boarded from Barcelona in Spain. Several days into the cruise, the couple made new friends, most of whom were other couples, but one particular individual was a 20-year-old man named Josh Askin, who was attending the trip with his family. Josh met Jennifer and George while the group visited Florence in Italy. On the night of July 5th, however, things on the cruise ship took a turn. CCTV showed Jennifer and George entering the third-floor casino at around midnight. Beforehand, the couple had spent the day in Greece and had dinner together, toasting to their future together. The CCTV footage of George is the last footage of him. While in the casino, George drank absinthe, which had reportedly been snuck on board as it was not available on the ship, with Josh Askin and 3 young Russian-American men that he had also met, named Gregory Rosenberg, Rusty Kaufman, and Zach Rosenberg. Meanwhile, Jennifer was allegedly getting close to one of the crew members. The pair flirted back and forth, which upset George, and he and his wife entered into an argument that resulted in Jennifer kicking her new husband in the crotch before storming out. This was reportedly around 2:30 in the morning. According to Josh, the men partied late into the night, and when they decided to eventually return to their cabins, they realized that George could barely walk, and so they accompanied him back to his room. However, George realized his wife wasn't there, so they all went looking for Jennifer together. When they couldn't locate her, the group of men returned George to his room once again. According to Josh's story, he went to use the bathroom, and when he came back, the other men had taken off George's shoes and put him to bed just after 4 a.m. From here, the 4 men claimed that they stayed a short while in the room, then returned to their own cabin where they ordered a large amount of food, so much food that they took pictures of it and of themselves with their meals. However, according to a Californian deputy police sheriff named Cletus Hyman, who was staying next door to George, this was not the case. He called to complain about the noise levels in George's room, and claimed that this was not the first time he had done so. Hyman watched out of his peephole and saw 3 men leave George's room and walk down the hallway. He heard George ushering people out of the room beforehand. It's unknown who exactly Hyman saw leaving the room. Shortly after this, he heard a, quote, horrific thud. It sounded like someone had fallen onto the balcony, and that the sound had caused vibrations in his room. This was around 4:30 a.m. Around this time, Jennifer was found passed out in the hallway of the ship by some of the crew, and has very little memory of what happened after leaving the casino. At 7:30 the following morning, passengers of the cruise noted a huge blood stain on one of the awnings of the ship and alerted the crew members. Jennifer assumed her husband was sleeping elsewhere and left for an appointment she'd made for the 2 of them at the on-board spa. She was later alerted by the ship's crew, and it was realised that George must have gone overboard somewhere between Greece and Turkey. Early on in the investigation into the disappearance of George Smith IV, the captain waved the incident off as an accident, but many online sleuths, along with George's family, are not so sure. Small traces of blood were found in George's cabin, and the investigators working the case treated it as a homicide. On July 29th, the FBI announced their involvement with the case. The bizarre tale received much media coverage from the likes of Geraldo Rivera, 48 Hours and Dateline NBC, who made the suggestion that it was a robbery gone wrong. The case even inspired its own made-for-TV movie called Deadly Honeymoon. In 2012, the New York Post reported that the case had been handed over to the Mafia Division of the FBI. It is unknown why. In 2012, Mike Jones, the Smith family lawyer, accrued documents from the cruise company which raised doubts about the accounts given by the 4 men who accompanied George back to his cabin on the night he went missing. According to them, they ordered a massive amount of food, but the cabin has no record of this supposed room service order. Josh Askin, the 20-year-old Californian who'd befriended George on the cruise, failed an FBI polygraph test, and while being questioned by the Smith family lawyer, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right. One of the Rosenberg cousins' polygraph tests with the FBI came back as inconclusive. The other 2 men's results are unknown. However, Josh's lawyer, Keith Greer, maintains that his client was with the other men in the cabin across the ship when George disappeared, and that Josh had passed a polygraph which had been administered earlier on in the investigation. We also must remember that polygraph tests are notoriously unreliable. He also claims that the FBI is in possession of the photos which showed the men with their food in the early hours of July 5th, and that the timestamps on those images prove that the men were in their cabin when George went missing. 7 years after the incident, Mike Jones, the Smith family lawyer, learned of a videotape made by some of the men just hours after the disappearance. The 3 Russian-American men are seen and heard making callous jokes about George's death, stating, quote, "We gave that guy a paragliding lesson without a parachute," with Gregory Rosenberg adding at the end, quote, "I told you I was gangster." Although the family only learned of the tape in 2012, the FBI had known about it since 2005. Adding further fuel to the fire, the 3 Russian-American men and their families were reportedly kicked off the cruise just 3 days after the disappearance, when a 20-year-old woman came forward and claimed she had been raped by Kaufman and the Rosenberg cousins. Josh Askin was allegedly present for part of it, and the assault had been filmed on Rusty Kaufman's camera. Jennifer, after being questioned by Turkish authorities, chose not to remain on the cruise and instead flew back home. She has been heavily criticized by the Smith family for her behavior following George's disappearance, including for when she accepted $1.1 million in compensation from the cruise line and publicly stated that she believed George died in an accident resulting from his levels of intoxication. In 2009, she remarried and has 2 children. However, a Daily Mail article from 2015 notes that she has since changed her belief and now believes that George was murdered. Despite all the suspicious goings-on, the FBI dropped their criminal investigation into the case in 2015. George's body has never been recovered, and no charges have ever been brought in his case. Li Yinglei. In February of 2017, 36-year-old Li Yinglei, who often went by Angie, boarded the MSC Cruises MSC Magnifica for a 10-day Mediterranean cruise with her husband, Daniel Belling, and their 2 children, aged 4 and 6. The family departed on February 9th, but when the ship returned to Italy on February 19th, only 3 of the 4 family members left the MSC Magnifica. Daniel and the 2 children were about to board a flight back to their home of Dublin, Ireland, when the Italian authorities approached the family and brought the 46-year-old, who was an IT consultant, into custody. The children were collected by their paternal grandparents, who lived in Germany. The ship's crew realised that someone was missing due to the onboard security measures. It was detected that 1 less person had passed through the ship's turnstile while leaving, and the crew managed to narrow this down to Daniel and Angie's family before alerting authorities. Daniel was immediately treated as suspect number 1. He had told nobody that his wife was missing. He had not raised the alarm or even seemed concerned that she was simply gone from the ship. He also gave the police conflicting information. Daniel told authorities that he last saw Angie after the ship stopped at the Greek port. She apparently stayed on board while he took the children out on an excursion, and when they returned, she was gone. He explained that his wife was very unhappy and ready to leave the cruise, and that she often disappeared from family vacations. He assumed she was hiding out somewhere and would meet them in Italy, or perhaps she had left for good this time and returned to Dublin. When she didn't show in Italy, he guessed that Angie had escaped their marriage and returned to her native China, claiming that she had threatened to do this several times before. Angie was last seen by crew members on the 2nd day of the cruise, February 10th, where an odd interaction by the couple was seen by employees of the gift shop. Reportedly, Daniel had stormed into the store, pulling out a pair of trainers from his backpack and saying to his wife, quote, "Put these on instead of your sandals and shut up." Witnesses claimed that Angie looked shaken after the interaction, and none of the crew saw her again. She was absent at mealtimes. The children and Daniel ate alone, and Daniel reportedly told the maid that they did not need to make up the fold-out bed, as there was only 3 people sleeping in the room now, and they would share the main bed. There are mixed reports about Angie's possessions, however. Several articles claimed that her phone, passport, and suitcase were missing, while most claimed that Angie had left them behind. Daniel had apparently packed up her belongings and planned to take them back with him to Dublin. It's unknown how or why Angie would have left without her possessions, particularly her phone and passport, since she was in a foreign country. Contradicting his earlier statement, Daniel at one point claimed that Angie had gotten off the ship in Greece after all, to meet for business with the Chinese community that resided there. Angie was a wedding planner with her own business named Cinderella's Wedding, which she started up in 2015. The business was aimed at Asian brides and grooms, and offered dress rentals and wedding photo album design, among many other things. Another contradictory statement was offered by the children, who said that their father asked them to stay in the cabin one night while Daniel and Angie went out, but their mother never returned. Angie's mother was not alerted to her missing daughter by Daniel or the investigators. She found out through a friend who could read and speak English and who found and translated the article for her. Upon hearing that Angie was missing, her mother confirmed that she had not returned home to China. She also said in a sworn statement that her daughter and her daughter's husband frequently fought and had a tumultuous marriage. After one particularly bad argument, spurred on by Daniel taking the children away to Germany for 10 days without saying anything, Angie reportedly ended up with bruises on her wrists. As a result, she kicked her husband out of their shared home, letting him in the next day only so he could have breakfast, take the kids to school, and work from home. Despite this, Angie's mother denies thinking that Daniel is involved in her daughter's disappearance, claiming that she had a good relationship with her son-in-law and that he is a, quote, very good person. She also went to visit him in prison in Italy. She did, however, add that she didn't believe her daughter would leave her children behind or commit suicide. Angie's mother last heard from her daughter on February 7th, 2017, just days before the cruise. Cruise ship workers also noted that one of the Bellings' children was found wandering the ship alone and crying on the evening of February 15th. It's unknown why or if this has anything to do with the case. Some articles about the family claim that they were struggling financially and ask how the family afforded to go on the cruise in the first place. Then, on April 8th, 2017, investigators thought they'd finally cracked the case when two men working on their boat in the town of Rimini on the Adriatic coast found a dark blue suitcase floating in the water. It crashed into their vessel, so they hauled it from the water and noticed its considerable weight. When they opened it up, they found the body of an Asian woman wrapped in black bin bags. When authorities arrived, they immediately suspected that the body belonged to the missing 36-year-old Li Yinglei. However, there were a few things that didn't seem to add up. Firstly, if the case had been thrown overboard, it must have travelled 750 miles out to sea, and it simply did not show that kind of wear and tear. Secondly, witnesses noted that the Belling family carried matching, multicoloured cases. They did not own a dark blue one. A day later, authorities began to really have doubts when they realised the woman in the suitcase had longer hair, was much thinner, and even a little taller than Angie. The autopsy confirmed via DNA testing that the body was not that of Li Yinglei, but of an unidentified woman who had died from starvation. The woman's body bore no signs of violence, and law enforcement believed that she went into the case and bin bags while alive. The case is estimated to have been in the water for around 10 days. 1 year later, in April of 2018, Daniel Belling was freed from the Italian prison he'd been in for a year. At the hearing, his lawyer told the courts that in 2013, Angie had told an official at Tulsa, Ireland's Children and Family Agency, that she was fed up of life in Dublin and wanted to go back to China. Ireland's Crime Call series did an episode on the case in March of 2017, where they discussed the idea that Angie's body was disposed of in her own suitcase. If the case was thrown overboard, it's likely it will have washed up in Egypt or Libya. In 2019, it was reported that Daniel Belling was facing 7 charges under the Theft and Fraud Act in relation to mortgage fraud, among other things. As of summer of 2020, Daniel is now facing charges of killing his wife and destroying her body. The case is still ongoing. Manuel Blanco Romasanta. Born in Escos, Spain, on November 18, 1809, Manuel Blanco Romasanta is Spain's first recorded serial killer. He was one of 5 children, born to relatively wealthy parents, but an unnamed birth defect appeared to throw his early life into confusion when he was wrongly identified as a female upon his birth. For the first 6 years of his life, Manuel was named Manuela, and was dressed and educated as a female would be. After being identified as a male, Manuel's life did not get any easier. He was already treated differently due to his birth defect, so the added complexity of being thought of as a female, then a male, made his upbringing that much more complicated. Remember, this was a much more judgmental and prejudiced era. Although he came from a well-off family, Manuel's parents made little time for him. He excelled in education, however, and quickly learned how to read and to write. By the time Manuel reached his mid-teens, he had stopped growing. He is estimated to have been somewhere between 4'6" and 4'11". As an adult, Manuel attempted to lead a normal life. He worked as a tailor and got married, but when his wife suddenly passed away in 1833, he traded in his traditional lifestyle for one which would take him on the road, and he became a travelling salesman who ventured throughout Spain and Portugal, before becoming a guide to those who wanted to pass through the mountains of Castile. In 1844, Manuel's life took a shocking turn when he was charged with the murder of a man named Vincent Fernandez, a constable in Leon who was trying to collect a debt from Manuel. The debt was owed to a supplier in Ponferrada for the purpose of merchandise. However, Manuel could not be arrested because he fled the area using a fake passport and the name Antonio Gomez. Although he was not present at the trial, it went ahead, and he was sentenced in absentia to 10 years in prison. After this, Manuel lived on the run, knowing that a decade behind bars awaited him if he got caught. He continued to travel around and even spent time near his hometown, and spent years living and working without being apprehended. He befriended local women with ease and took on jobs that were not common for men at the time, including making yarn, cleaning, and cooking. This gave other men the impression that he was effeminate, and he was said to be too gentle. Sometime after this, Manuel returned to work as a guide in the mountains. Then, over a period of years, in the town that Manuel had settled in and in the surrounding area, people began to go missing. For a while, these disappearances were kept relatively quiet because Manuel was writing home to the families of those who had gone missing, writing as their loved ones and keeping up the pretense that they were still traveling. This kept suspicion at bay for some time. When the vanishings were finally noticed, nobody suspected that Manuel was involved, as there was simply no connection between him and the missing. When the bodies began to be found, some had been so brutally mutilated that their family members couldn't even identify them. Suspicions slowly started to grow. Whispers started, claiming that Manuel was killing people and selling their belongings. But it wasn't until 1852 that the first formal accusation came out against him. The allegation said he'd used the body fat of his victims to make soap, which he then sold. This was later proven to be true. In September that year, Manuel was arrested in Nombela. He was later transferred to the town of Alares, where he was put on trial for 13 murders. His victims were between the ages of 10 and 47. At the start of the trial, the now 43-year-old admitted guilt to all 13 cases. However, he claimed he was not responsible for any of them, for he was suffering a curse which caused him to turn into a wolf. Manuel went on to say that the first time he transformed, he was in the mountains and was approached by 2 wolves. He stated that during his transformation, he fell to the ground and his body began to convulse before he rolled over 3 times. He claimed to have spent 5 days as a wolf before he and the 2 others turned back into their human forms. The other 2 men were supposedly named Antonio and Don, and Manuel explained that they were also cursed, and the trio ate people when they got hungry. Even in the mid-19th century, in the middle of a famine and the population's sanity worsening, Manuel's story was heavily disbelieved by the courts. The prosecutor asked him to transform and to prove it, but the 43-year-old claimed that he could not transform any longer because the curse lasted 13 years and had expired in the week prior to his trial. Manuel was acquitted of 4 of the murders because they were found to be the result of an actual wolf attack. But the other 9 victims showed signs of being butchered by a human, and so he was convicted of them all. The trial lasted 7 months and concluded on April 6, 1853. The resulting court transcript was around 2,000 pages long. Manuel was sentenced to death via garrote. Then, a man known only as Mr. Phillips wrote to the Spanish Minister of Justice, claiming that the 45-year-old was suffering from clinical lycanthropy, a psychiatric syndrome that involves the delusion that the sufferer can transform into, or simply is, an animal. Mr. Phillips claimed that he could treat Manuel with hypnosis. The identity of this Mr. Phillips is not confirmed, but it is believed that he was a French physician who was living in London at the time, who had been exiled to the UK and later returned to France under the pseudonym Mr. Phillips. The minister then wrote to the Queen of Spain, Isabella II, who personally commuted Manuel's sentence in May of 1854 to allow experts to study the case. From here, Manuel was transferred to a prison in Celanova, where the 45-year-old was reported to have passed away shortly after arriving. There are mixed stories about Manuel's end, with some saying he was shot by a prison guard who wanted to see him transform, and others saying he simply passed away from an illness. Since the records from the prison where he ended up no longer exist, there have been several attempts to discover Manuel's true fate, including 2 newspaper articles in 2011 that stated he had died on December 14, 1863, from stomach cancer. Modern theories about Manuel propose that he had antisocial personality disorder, or perhaps had an intersex condition. Manuel was never suspected of having a hand in his wife's demise, and his tale inspired 2 movies in Spain. He has now reportedly become a part of Spanish folklore as the werewolf of Alares, and is known as the Tallow Man, a nickname he earned from his time spent making soap from the fat of his victims. Although his case is largely forgotten outside of Spain, he is perhaps one of the most gruesome serial killers of the 19th century. John Edward Ruelof. John Edward Ruelof, who is also known to go by the surname Rulofsson, was born on July 9, 1820, in New Brunswick, Canada. He was known for having several careers across the span of his life, including a lawyer, schoolmaster, photographer, and philologist, but was perhaps known most notably as a career criminal. A self-taught linguist who had mastered several languages, he was considered an extremely intelligent but dangerous individual. John is also known as the Man of 2 Lives, which stemmed from a biography written on his life in 1871, and as the Genius Killer, a name which followed the discovery of his large brain after he passed away. John's brain is reportedly the 2nd largest on record, and is currently on display at the Wilder Brain Collection in the Psychology Department of Cornell University in New York. Although not much is known about John's upbringing, we know that his parents were German immigrants, and that he had a brother named William who went on to become a successful photographer. By the time John was 20, he had worked in a law firm and served 2 years in prison for embezzlement, cementing his status as the Man of 2 Lives. In 1842, John moved to Dryden in upstate New York, where he worked as a school teacher and studied botanical medicine with Dr. Henry Bull. The following year, the 20-something married Dr. Bull's 17-year-old cousin, a girl named Harriet Shutt. The couple ditched the traditional formal courtship, and their marriage went against the Shutt's family wishes, who didn't want the pair to marry because John was of a lower social standing. Regardless of this, they married on December 31st, 1843. John was noted to be a possessive and jealous husband. Weeks after they married, he reportedly hit his wife with a pestle and frequently beat her. Reportedly, he once saw Harriet kiss Dr. Bull, and he subsequently pulled her aside and pulled a vial from his pocket, telling her it contained poison. He claimed it was the same one he'd used to kill his niece and sister-in-law, who had died while in his medical care. John was supposed to treat the pair after they caught an infection, but they are thought to be the first victims in his killing spree. John told Harriet to drink the poison and they would die together. However, his wife began screaming desperately for help instead, so he attempted to calm her down and told her it was all a simple joke. Despite the dangerous nature of their relationship, Harriet stayed with John, and the couple moved to Lansing, New York, where Harriet gave birth to a baby girl named Priscilla. John wanted his family to move further away from the Schutts, and on June 22, 1844, the couple fought about this. John tried to pressure Harriet into moving to Ohio, where he planned to go into law or teaching, but she refused and threatened to return to her family with the baby. In return, John accused his wife of having an affair with Dr. Bull, before fatally hitting her on the head with a large, heavy pestle. After this, John decided he would commit suicide, but found that he simply couldn't. The next day, he borrowed a horse and wagon from his neighbors on the pretense of returning a large chest to his uncle. His neighbors watched as he placed a large sack into the wagon, and they noticed that John headed off towards Cayuga Lake, which was in the opposite direction of where he said he was going. When he returned, the chest was still in the wagon, but the sack was gone. John told his neighbors that he and the family would be out of town for a few weeks and reportedly left his house in disarray. When he returned, rumors were circulating that John had killed his wife and child. Although he denied this, the Schutt family then confronted him. Although John at first said that Harriet had left him, he later changed his story to say that the trio had moved to Ohio. But the family did not accept these excuses, especially since all of Harriet's clothing and belongings still remained in the home she had shared with John. Although he then attempted to flee the city once more, John was pursued by his brother-in-law. During this time, he traveled through Geneva, Rochester, and Buffalo before his brother-in-law found him and apprehended him in Cleveland. John was then brought to Ithaca so he could stand trial. Cayuga Lake was dredged for signs of either Harriet or Priscilla's body, but neither could be found. Since the grand jury was unwilling to indict John for a murder without a body, he was charged instead with kidnapping. At his 1846 trial, John acted as his own defense attorney, focusing on the lack of evidence that the prosecution had that a crime had even been committed. Nevertheless, he was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While in jail, John did not waste his time. He studied philology, the study of the historical development and structure of languages, and formulated his own theory about language evolution, which he intended to publish when he was released from prison. He was even given special permission to teach others in his cell. John's future plans started to crumble, however, when he was informed that Tompkins County planned to charge him with murder upon his release. So he countered this by claiming double jeopardy and began a legal battle from jail. The DA dropped the charges for Harriet's murder and instead replaced it with Priscilla's. Although John was found guilty in 1858, he escaped custody before he could be sentenced. It is widely believed that his escape was aided by one of two people. It was either Albert Jarvis, the son of Ithaca's undersheriff, who'd been tutored by John in Greek and Latin and who would later go on to become his partner in crime, or by Jane, Albert's mother, who'd befriended John and who claimed that he couldn't possibly be guilty of slaying his wife and child. John fled west. He reportedly fed on wild nuts and food stolen from farms. During his time as a fugitive, he lost 2 toes to frostbite. When he reached Pennsylvania, he quickly made connections and impressed the higher-ups at Jefferson College, who offered him a professorship, but then he received a letter from Albert Jarvis, who claimed that he and his mother were penniless and needed help. Albert threatened John if he didn't help them, so John went on to burglarize a jewelry store, where he was caught and sent back to Ithaca. Despite the fact that multiple charges were piling up against the 38-year-old, he managed to get acquitted from his murder conviction and was released when authorities decided not to prosecute further. After this, John moved to New York City, where he and Albert Jarvis got by as career criminals, stealing from wherever and whoever they could. In 1861, John spent a further 2 years in prison, where he would meet William Dexter, whom he utilized as a partner in his criminal activities. The next robbery that the trio planned was that of a dry goods store in New York on August 17, 1870. 2 employees, Frederick Merrick and Gilbert Burroughs, slept upstairs, while the 3 men broke in. They burned chloroform to keep the employees sleeping, but they awoke anyway when Albert Jarvis stumbled on something. Merrick attempted to shoot at the burglars, but after the gun failed to discharge, he grabbed a stool and threw it at the men instead. John was already beginning to run from the scene, but William Dexter was grabbed by Burroughs, and the 2 store employees began to beat him. Albert and John returned to save William, with John firing a warning shot into the air. The store employees didn't stop, however, even after a second shot, so John pulled the trigger on Merrick, killing him instantly. The 3 burglars made their escape, but by this point they had missed the boat which would take them across the Chenango River. They attempted to swim across, but both Albert and William succumbed to the currents, with only John making it to the other side alive. He apparently left his shoes on the shore and left distinct footprints which showed that he was missing 2 toes, a vital clue for law enforcement. The bodies of the other men were recovered the following morning. Meanwhile, the remaining store employee, Gilbert Burrows, alerted police to what had happened, and the next day, law enforcement began rounding up men who appeared to be suspicious. John put a target on his back when he refused to give his name to a police officer and instead ran across the nearby railroad tracks and was found in a farm's outhouse. John tried to pass himself off as one of his many aliases, using the name Charles Augustus and later the name George Williams. He was brought before the two bodies of his accomplices from the burglary and denied knowing them, but he was recognized by an onlooker, a judge who remembered him from the murders of his wife and child. John's new trial began in January of 1871, and it became a media sensation, drawing in thousands of spectators. Once again, John, now aged 50, led his own defense. He was found guilty on March 3rd and was sentenced to be hanged. While on death row, he finally admitted to killing his wife and described her demise in great detail. However, he did not admit to executing 3-month-old Priscilla, leaving many to wonder if he gave her over to family members to be cared for. John Ruesch was executed on May 18, 1871. Despite being given the label of genius, many believe John was simply a fraud and a pretender, although there is no denying that he was a talented conman who had managed to escape justice on numerous occasions and had swung himself excellent, well-paid positions, despite having very little in the way of actual qualifications. In recent years, John Ruesch's legacy has mostly faded into obscurity. A bar named after him was opened in Ithaca in 1977, but has since closed down. John was the last man to be executed by public hanging in the state of New York. The fate of Priscilla, John's daughter, remains unknown, and neither her body nor her mother's have ever been found. Suzanne Lindholm. Suzanne Lindholm was born on December 9, 1950. At the time of her death in 1976, she was 25 years old and working at the service desk for Finnair at Helsinki Airport in Finland. On Saturday, August 7th, after finishing work, Suzanne decided to go out on the town and party. She invited several of her work friends and colleagues, but all of them declined to go with her. So she called one of her male friends, who came and picked her up and gave her a ride to Western Helsinki. It was here, in Haga, that Suzanne met with her sister Camilla. The pair hung out at a hotel bar. By this time it was after 10 p.m. After finishing up at the hotel, Suzanne and her sister went to a club in central Helsinki. While having fun and drinks with Camilla, Suzanne met a Norwegian man who has never been publicly named. He was there on a business trip, and the couple hit it off immediately. Camilla decided to go home at around 1:20 a.m., catching the last bus back home, but Suzanne and her new friend left together to visit the bar in the Hotel Hesperia. Reportedly, the couple visited the unidentified man's hotel room where they shared a nightcap. At around 3 a.m., however, Suzanne decided she was ready to go home, as she had work again the next day. She declined to allow the man to escort her home, but the pair exchanged phone numbers and arranged to meet the following day. Suzanne was last seen outside of the hotel, looking around between 3 and 3:10 a.m. Later police inquiries discovered that she had likely walked along Mannerheim-Minti, the street where the hotel was located, and they decided that she had not chosen to hitchhike. Since the last bus home was the one on which her sister had boarded at 1:20 a.m, there was no public transport available for Suzanne to get home. She reportedly carried no cash on her either, and investigators failed to find any taxi driver who admitted to driving her home. Because of this, Suzanne's last movements are unknown to law enforcement. Hotel Hesperia was around 2.5 miles away from Suzanne's home, which she shared with her siblings and her parents. The family had lived in the home, in Kapula, since 1960. The building had a basement which was largely used to store bikes, and it was here, while retrieving a tyre pump for his own bicycle, that a neighbour found Suzanne's body on August 8th at 1:15 p.m. Suzanne's end had been a violent one. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled with her work scarf. Skin found beneath her fingernails, among other evidence, showed that the 25-year-old had fought back viciously, but that she had ultimately been overpowered. Her clothes were disheveled, and there were mixed reports about items left with Suzanne's body. Some claim that a ski pole and a child's plastic shovel were placed over the corpse, while a Finnish magazine reported that her body had been covered with her jacket. Immediately, authorities suspected that the crime was sexually motivated. While canvassing the neighbours, they uncovered a potentially important piece of information. A neighbour reported hearing crying at around 4 o'clock in the morning, but claimed that they thought nothing of it and went back to sleep. The landlord of the building had been away for several days, so knew nothing of what happened, while the caretaker reported hearing nothing unusual. Police believe Suzanne met her end within an hour of leaving the hotel, between 3 and 4 a.m. As police retraced Suzanne's steps from the night before, they were perplexed at how she had gotten home. According to them, it was simply too long a walk for her to get home alone in the dark. The area in which Suzanne lived was poorly lit and quiet in 1976 and had several small, dense forests nearby. They wondered if she had accepted a ride with her killer, or if he had barged into the building later on when she arrived at home. Her sister Camilla disputes the idea that she got into a car with a stranger, claiming that just months prior to her passing, Suzanne had told Camilla that she would never do such a thing. During the course of their investigation, the police interviewed people Suzanne had met with while out the night before, and her neighbours. They had a small suspect list, including a taxi driver and the Norwegian man Suzanne had met that night, but both had solid alibis and were eventually ruled out of the investigation. Hundreds of interviews were conducted, and police searched for and stayed alert for signs of any predators roaming near the Hesperian Hotel. The case received considerable media attention, and when the information about the skin under Suzanne's fingernails was released, law enforcement was flooded with tips regarding people with scars, most of which led nowhere and actually slowed the investigation down. There was, however, a man with scratches on his face who was detained for questioning by police, but little information is available on him, and he was ultimately released. Although law enforcement has never been able to establish Suzanne's exact route back home, they decided that since nobody had seen her or picked her up, she was likely taken home in a car, perhaps by someone she knew. Her family think it's unlikely that she walked home alone because she preferred not to draw attention on herself, and she would probably have felt safer on public transport or with someone she knew. As a result, police suggest several theories: that she was followed home and surprised by her attacker, or that her attacker had driven her home, or that they both met by the building door. They also added that they believed the perpetrator was young and in good shape in 1976, and that the execution was not premeditated. They profiled the culprit as someone who was abnormal, lonely, mentally disturbed, someone who avoided relationships of any kind, and someone who displayed sexually problematic behavior. One clue that has many scratching their heads is that when Suzanne's body was found, it was noted that she had 2 gold rings which were missing. For a short while, authorities wondered if robbery had been the motive all along, but this was quickly dismissed. Online sleuths have proposed the idea that she attempted to use the rings for her cab fare, since she had no money, whilst others have speculated that the killer took them as a trophy. Police and Suzanne's parents believe that she was forced into the basement that night. Her parents noted that if their daughter had brought someone home, she would take them to her room. Others who knew her said she was easily annoyed and did not tolerate harassment. They believe that if it was not consensual, Suzanne would have kicked up a fuss and let everyone know. There were no signs of forced entry to the basement, and Suzanne's keys were found in her pocket, suggesting that she had possibly let the perpetrator into the cellar with her. The case has been reinvestigated numerous times in recent years, including 2004 and 2014. In 2014, a TV report garnered new clues, but the two suspects in the case had watertight alibis. Although Suzanne's case has grown cold in recent years, law enforcement had numerous theories about her slaying in the 70s and 80s. Police thought that there may have been an unidentified serial killer stalking the streets of Helsinki in the 80s, when a 41-year-old woman turned up dead in 1980, and a 42-year-old met the same fate a year later in 1981. Both of these women's cases were similar to Suzanne's. They had been raped and executed in their apartment building's basement, and both had been out drinking and partying before heading home. In 1995, the chief investigator said that the suspected perpetrator's name was known to the police, but that there wasn't enough evidence to arrest and charge him. Then, in 1982, a bus driver living in Espoo was investigated. Yelo Eetu Seppänen raped and murdered an 18-year-old woman in Haga 5 months after the last basement victim was found. He and his victim had encountered each other on their way home, and he had taken trophies from her. He claimed he was motivated by his desire to take revenge on women who had ditched him. It was noted that his marriage ended shortly before Suzanne met her demise. While Seppänen was suspected of being involved in Suzanne's case, he was never convicted. In 1979, for a brief time, Suzanne's case was thought to be linked to that of a travel agent whom the media claimed was a friend of the 25-year-olds. Helena Corlin, 28, had gone missing and was later located, having been strangled and dismembered by a sex offender named Karl Erik Djorkaeus. However, the possible connection between these two tragic cases was later abandoned. Today, 44 years later, the disturbing case of Suzanne Lindholm remains unsolved. Auli Kilikki-Saari. Auli Kilikki-Saari was born on December 6, 1935, in Isojoki, and she was the youngest of 6 children. On the day she went missing in 1953, she was just 17 years old. Her case is one of the most infamous and longest running in Finland's history. On Sunday, May 17, 1953, Kilikki cycled 8 miles to her church. Extremely religious, Kilikki worked in the administrative office of her parish. On this particular day, when the 17-year-old returned home, she told her parents she felt tired and retired to her room for a rest. According to her parents, this was unusual behaviour, but they didn't think too much of it. Later that night, at around 6 p.m, Kilikki set off on her bike again. This time she was going to an evening prayer meeting. According to friends, Kilikki had been anxious and nervous all day. It's unknown what exactly had frightened her, but the teenager said she felt uneasy about travelling home alone at that time of night. On her return journey, Kilikki travelled partway with a friend, but the pair separated at the crossroads near a milk processing plant. This was around 10:30 p.m. A witness saw Kilikki at around 10:40 p.m, roughly a mile past the crossroads, where she and her friend split from one another. This is the last known sighting of the 17-year-old alive. Back at home, Kilikki's parents did not think anything of the fact that she hadn't returned. She often went to stay with friends, so they assumed that this was the case. However, after several days had passed, on May 20th, police organised a search party for the missing teenager. 30 locals participated in the search, but they found no trace of Kilikki or even her bike. Word quickly began to spread about her disappearance, and the following day, the witness who saw her on May 17th came forward. On May 21st, a specialist detective from Vasa was brought in to handle the investigation. The search for the 17-year-old was widened to include marshy areas and forest land, with over 100 people volunteering to help the search. The following day, May 22nd, a farmer and his son, who were out transporting milk on the same road on which Kilikki was last seen, saw some odd clues. They saw bike tracks, footprints, car tracks, and even some shattered glass. It appeared to the pair as if there had been a struggle. While they alerted police as quickly as possible, by the time authorities arrived at the scene, much of the evidence had been disturbed or destroyed by other traffic on the road. there was no trace of the shattered glass either. In the initial weeks following Kyllikki's disappearance, the case was far from cold. Just a week after the 17-year-old went missing, several witnesses came forward to report a cream-coloured car which had been driving along the road Kyllikki had used to get home, the same one on which she was last seen. One 12-year-old eyewitness told law enforcement that they'd seen a blonde man driving the car with a bike in the trunk on the night of May 17th. They added that there were two other men in the car, one of average build, the other one large. The car was driving fast with the lights off, despite the fact that it was late at night. This same car was seen by a mother and a daughter who were sitting on their porch in the village of Uro. The car drove past and had a tyre sticking out of the trunk. Half an hour later, the car returned. However, despite the amount of eyewitnesses who recalled seeing the car, it could not be located, nor could the driver who was last seen inside of it. A month later, on July 22nd, two people who were out picking berries deep in a forest saw a bike tyre in the nearby marshland. Upon closer inspection, they found a bike in the low water. Both tyres had been deflated, likely in the hopes that it would sink more easily, and it was located hundreds of meters from the main road. There were traces of rust on the bike, but no other damage to it, prompting the belief that Kyllikki had been purposefully abducted and had not perished in some sort of tragic accident. Due to the isolated location in which the bike was hidden, authorities determined that the perpetrator must have known the area well. When that same area had been searched in May, the water levels had been high, and although metal detectors were utilised, nothing was found. This led police to believe that the bike had been dumped there at a later time. However, the bike was quickly returned to Kyllikki's parents and was not thoroughly examined, which possibly led to a loss of evidence. In October, the road on which Kyllikki had last been seen was searched again. On October 10th, something finally was found. It was the 17-year-old's shoe, wrapped in her own scarf, along with one sock belonging to a man. The items had been tied together with a black woolen thread, and teeth marks observed on the scarf suggested to authorities that it had been used as a gag. The owner of the sock has never been identified. Like the bike, police believe that the shoe had been placed there later, as it was not seen during initial searches. Just one day later, on October 11th, a searcher noticed a dry pine stick pointing out of a nearby tussock. The shoe had been found close by. The searcher pulled on the stick, noticing that the end was sharpened. A foul smell began to emanate from the area, and so the authorities were alerted. Underneath the grass and soil, about 200 meters from the road, was the body of the 17-year-old Kyllikki Saari. The body was naked from the waist down, Kyllikki's head wrapped up with her own coat. She had a torn bra and suffered a broken nose and cheekbone. Due to her body being badly decomposed, it couldn't be determined what other injuries she had suffered before her demise. However, her cause of death was established as blunt force trauma to the skull. The murder weapon was suspected to be a stick or stone. She had not been strangled or shot, and there was no evidence of sexual assault. Although authorities felt it was still possible, the crime was sexually motivated. The careful construction of the grave suggested to authorities that their offender possibly had some training as a military engineer. An expert at the University of Helsinki shed some light on the stick which had pierced Kyllikki's body post-mortem. It had been cut from a tree in August at the earliest, and had been sharpened with a type of Finnish knife named a puukko by a left-handed person. However, there were no pine trees in the immediate area. Although authorities did some searching for the specific tree the stick came from, it was never located. On October 14th, Kyllikki's other shoe turned up. However, it offered no further information. Her watch, red purse and hymn book, all three of which she was carrying when she went missing, have never been located either. Law enforcement was not short of leads in Kyllikki's case. One of their prime suspects was a parish priest that remained a suspect for many years. He moved to Merikavia just weeks before the disappearance. The 17-year-old girl had written him a letter in the days prior to her vanishing in regards to some religious issues she was having. Despite this, the priest claimed that he didn't know Kyllikki that well. However, this priest had a strong alibi. He had taken part in a party that evening, then spent time in the clergy house. The following morning at 8 AM, he had a class to attend. In total, the police couldn't account for around 20 minutes of his time, but he also didn't have a car or driver's license, so police felt that he simply couldn't have made it to the crime scene and back and had the time to attack Kyllikki. Despite this, many online sleuths consider him a strong suspect even today, for several reasons. The priest was later found to have had improper relations during the war and was expelled from his African missionary work due to his relationship with a local nurse. He was known to flirt with young women and in 1955 had a relationship with an underage girl. He was later prosecuted for raping her and for getting engaged while being married to someone else. There are also rumours that he was either harassing or sexually abusing Kyllikki, but these whisperings appear to be unsubstantiated. The priest was mentioned in Kyllikki's diary, but it's not publicly known what she said about him. It's noted that one of his relatives had a car that looked similar to the one connected with the case. A local man, whose identity was hidden, told a Finnish magazine that he believed the priest was responsible, but that he did not execute Kyllikki by his own hand. Instead, he hired someone else to carry out the job. A German immigrant named Hans Assmann was also linked to the case, as well as being suspected of being involved in other murder cases. According to his wife, he and his driver were near the location at the time of the disappearance. He owned a light brown car, similar but not the same as the one seen by eyewitnesses at the time. In 1997, he allegedly confessed on his deathbed to a former police officer, claiming that he and his driver had accidentally hit Kyllikki on the night of May 17th, and to avoid responsibility, they decided to stage the scene to make it look like a homicide. He said that the accident was unavoidable. Assmann's wife added that when he returned home after that night, his shoes were wet and he was missing one sock. There were also dents in the car. She claimed that a few days later, her husband and driver went out again, but this time they took a shovel with them. Assmann is also known to be left-handed, like the perpetrator in Kyllikki's case. Another man suspected of being involved in the slaying of Kyllikki was a 38-year-old ditch digger who lived in a 1 to 2 kilometer radius of the crime scene. He reportedly suffered several mental illnesses and spent much of his time in and out of mental hospitals. In 1940, the man was found guilty for a sexual offence. He was a known peeping Tom. Authorities believed that the man may have gotten help from his brother-in-law, who had a criminal background, although his mother and sister claimed that the man was in bed from 7 PM after a day of heavy drinking. When interrogated by police, this man said that Kyllikki was no longer alive and that her body would never be found. He later recounted these words, claiming that he had been misunderstood. He was questioned twice in relation to the case, with one of these times being in the mental hospital, where the police were ordered by his doctor to stop, as his behaviour became increasingly erratic, strange, and confused. After this questioning, the man's brother-in-law, the man with the criminal history, moved away. Police suspected that the two could be responsible because they shared a working field just 50 meters from where the body was found. The shovel found there had been used to dig the grave. In 2002, investigators noted that they had strong, circumstantial evidence against the pair, who had both passed away by 1972, having never been charged in connection with Kyllikki's case. Kyllikki's funeral was held on October 25th, 1953. It was attended by 25,000 people. Despite the numerous leads and suspects in Kyllikki's case, almost 9 decades later, her brutal murder continues to go unsolved. The Walker family. Family and friends of the Walkers should have been able to celebrate their Christmas together with them in 1959, but due to the actions of one or multiple unidentified culprits, they ended up mourning the loss of their loved ones, grieving instead of enjoying the festive season. On the morning of December 20th, 1959, in Osprey, Florida, a ranch worker named Daniel McLeod went to pick up his colleague, 25-year-old Cliff Walker, as the pair planned to spend the day hog hunting. When Daniel pulled up his truck, however, he noticed the quiet stillness of the house and immediately felt a wave of anxiety hit him. Something was wrong. Cliff and his wife, 24-year-old Christine, had 2 young children, a little boy, Jimmy, who was 3, and a little girl, Debbie, who was just 1 year old. As a result, the family were often up at the crack of dawn, and the house they lived in constantly buzzed with the flurry of life. Daniel got out of his truck and headed to the front door of the Walkers' home. He knocked, but there was no answer. Concerned for the family's well-being, he then cut through the screen door and made his way into the home. What he found was a bloodbath. Christine was the first he saw. She was lying in the living room doorway. A .22 caliber bullet had been put through her skull. Later, law enforcement would discover that she had been sexually assaulted before meeting her demise. As Daniel looked around the room, he saw the bodies in the corner of Cliff and Jimmy. Both had been shot in the head. Debbie was nowhere to be seen, but Daniel had seen enough. He retreated from the house and called the local police department, who arrived and found 1-year-old Debbie in the bathtub. She had been shot and drowned. It has been theorized that the perpetrator drowned the little girl because they ran out of ammo and she didn't immediately pass away from the gunshot wound. Police in Osprey had their work cut out for them. They managed to ascertain that Christine had arrived home first after a day of running errands at 4 p.m, and that Cliff, with the children, had arrived sometime after. Since Christine had time to put the shopping away, it's been suggested that she knew the perpetrator and had possibly spent time speaking with them before she was attacked. What was also evident was that Christine had put up a ferocious fight against the culprit using her high heels, which were found with blood on them in the front porch. Authorities also discovered that several items were missing from the family's home: Cliff's pocket knife, Christine's high school majorette uniform, and the couple's marriage certificates. All of these items seemed peculiar things to steal, and the idea was proposed that Christine was the true target of the attack, and the culprit was in love with her or an ex-boyfriend of hers. Although police had a lot of theories, their evidence was limited. They found a cellophane strip from a cool cigarette wrapper, a fingerprint on the bathtub faucet, and a single bloody cowboy boot, presumably one that belonged to the family, although it is unclear. It's also noted that the perpetrator locked the front door behind them. In all, 587 people were considered suspects at one time or another. The suspect list included Daniel, who'd found the family's bodies, a neighbor who'd reportedly made advances towards Christine, and Elbert Walker, a cousin of Cliff's who had violent tendencies. A former partner of Christine's, a man named Curtis McCall, was also investigated. Rumors of an affair between the couple had made their rounds through the local town, and while McCall denied the rumors, he was never fully ruled out, although there was no evidence against him either. Regardless, none of these suspects panned out, and the motive behind the brutal slaying of the Walker family has never been identified. At some point after the murders, a serial killer named Emmett Monroe Spencer claimed that he was the perpetrator, but this confession was later discredited as Spencer was a known pathological liar. It was believed that Spencer had constructed his confession from murder write-ups in the local papers and the crime novels that he liked reading. After that, the Walker family case went cold for several decades. Then, in 2012, the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office began investigating links between the case and convicted murderers Perry Smith and Richard Hickok. The pair were career criminals who were convicted of killing 4 members of the Clutter family in Kansas in 1959 and were later executed in 1965 for the slayings. The Clutter family murders were discussed in the popular book In Cold Blood, which was also published in 1965. In the book, the author dismissed the idea that Smith and Hickok were responsible for the Walker family massacre because they had an alibi for the time in which the executions occurred. However, records and witnesses from investigators in Kansas and Florida contradict this account. Smith and Hickok had been considered suspects as far back as 1960. 34 days before the Walker murders, the criminals fled to Florida in a stolen car and checked into a motel just 4 hours away from Osprey. They then checked out on the morning of the Walker family massacre and were caught on December 30th, 1959 in Las Vegas, Nevada. A polygraph test issued in 1960 appeared to clear the pair of any involvement, but it is well known today that polygraph tests don't really prove anything and aren't even admissible in court. Experts have also noted that 1960 polygraph machines were famously inaccurate. In December of 2012, investigators announced that they were seeking an order to exhume Smith and Hickok's bodies for DNA. They hoped that it would match the semen sample which was taken from the Walker's crime scene. This exhumation was eventually carried out, but in 2013, it was announced that the DNA evidence from the bodies could not be conclusively matched to the crime scene evidence because it was contaminated. Only partial DNA was extracted from the crime scene sample, meaning that it neither proved nor disproved the pair's involvement in the case. Despite this setback, the pair remained the most viable suspects in the Walker's murder. Not only did witnesses see the two in the area at the time of the massacre, but a similar pocket knife to Cliff's was also found when the men were arrested. Some have theorized that, while in Florida, the pair knocked on the door of the Walker family and offered to sell them the car they'd stolen, a 1956 Chevy Bel Air, like the one that Cliff wanted to purchase, and Christine let the men inside. However, other online sleuths have argued that it seems more likely that the callous slaying of the family was more personal, given the items that were lifted from the home afterwards. In recent years, the marriage certificate that was taken has been recovered by Cliff's niece, who found it in amongst other items that were given to her by a family member. It is unknown if this unidentified family member was ever looked into by authorities. As of 2020, the Walker family massacre remains unsolved. Malvina Crutz. On January 29, 1958, 48-year-old Charles E. Crutz returned home from work at around 5 p.m. He lived in a 1.5-story home in a quiet neighborhood in Indianapolis's north side with his 41-year-old wife, Malvina, and their 10-year-old son, Charles Crutz Jr., who more often than not went by the name Buddy. At first, nothing seemed amiss in the house. Buddy was already home and had been for around an hour and a half. He was sitting in front of the TV, engrossed in an episode of his favorite show, The Adventures of Wild Bill Hickok. Charles's wife, Malvina, was nowhere to be seen or heard. As she was currently overseeing renovations to the family home, which had sustained damage from a house fire the previous month, it was not unusual for her not to be around. She often nipped out for errands, meetings with laborers, or had paperwork to finish up. When Charles asked his son about his mother's whereabouts, Buddy told him that he assumed she was doing his paper route. Reportedly, when Buddy came home for lunch earlier in the day, his mother had told him not to worry about it and that she'd do it for him. This seemed like a reasonable answer until Buddy told his father that he didn't like the look of his bedroom. He mentioned that his toys were in disarray. Confused, Charles decided to wash up before he investigated, but when he stepped into the bathroom, a feeling of uneasiness washed over him. The shower curtain had been pulled closed. When he drew the curtain back, Charles found his wife in the bathtub, lying on her side, submerged in water. Malvina's head was towards the faucet, her legs bent at the knees, and the tub had been filled to the overflow valve. The tap had been turned off. Charles noted that the body and the water were both still warm. Malvina had suffered cuts to the inside of her lips, bruises on the left eye, chin, each arm above the elbow, and on her left leg above the knee. The 41-year-old's white blouse had been ripped at the back, her cardigan was torn, and her underwear had been rolled down to her knees. She still wore shoes, and her trousers were later found soaking wet, inside out, on the floor of Buddy's bedroom. It was later determined that despite the state of her body, Malvina had not been sexually assaulted. Her official cause of death was listed as drowning, and the coroner believed she had been struck in the face or head before being placed in the water. By all accounts, Malvina was a kind and pleasant woman. She was not the type of person who people might expect to meet a violent end. Her neighbours described her as warm and friendly, while friends called her vivacious and active. Aside from being a mother and a housewife, she was also a PTA volunteer and a church worker. When police arrived on the scene, they began to put together the events of the 41-year-old's day. Earlier that afternoon, her friend, Mildred Warning, accompanied by another friend, Florence Kubert, stopped by to see the renovation in progress. According to Mildred, the pair had called Malvina at around 12:45 p.m. to let her know they would be coming, but instead of being greeted by the housewife's warm voice, they instead heard the sound of an unfamiliar man on the other end of the phone. It was not the voice of her husband, Charles. Mildred assumed that it was one of the workmen and asked to speak to Malvina. The man hesitated, and Mildred then told the stranger to tell Malvina they were coming. She then heard Malvina's voice call through, quote, "Tell her I'll pick her up at 1:30. Although another source reports that Malvina said, quote, "Tell her not to pick me up today." Regardless, an hour later, Mildred and Florence arrived at the home. As they drove towards Malvina's house, they saw a man run from it, get into her car, and drive away. While at first confused, the two friends soon dismissed this as a builder going for materials. This was something that happened frequently. There was no answer at the front door when the women knocked, so they made their way to the back door, which they found ajar. Inside, the pair waited for 20 minutes, but Malvina never showed. Before leaving, they left a note for her, and a new jacket for Buddy. When the police later asked the two women about who they'd seen get into the car, neither could identify him or describe him, but a 16-year-old neighbour claimed it was a black man who had been driving. Earlier that day at 12:10 p.m, Buddy came home from school for lunch. His meal was already waiting for him when he arrived, and he noticed that his mother's car was still in the garage. A milkman who was delivering around this time also spotted the car there. While Buddy was eating lunch, Malvina called out to him from the bathroom, telling him about how she would do his paper route. Although Buddy reportedly heard his mother, there is no evidence that states he physically saw her. The following morning, Malvina's car, a two-tone white and grey hardtop 1955 Buick, was located 11 blocks away, abandoned on the 4926 North Meridian Street. Although the area was searched, the car keys could not be located, and they were not inside the vehicle either. Confusingly, multiple witnesses claimed the car had been there since the morning of the 28th, the day before Malvina was found dead. A few notable pieces of evidence were found in the Krutz family home. Police ruled out robbery as a motive because they found expensive valuables and jewellery still present, and Malvina's purse and cash remained untouched. During their search of the house, however, they found 3 fingerprints, which did not belong to the family. They also discovered a pencil which had strands of hair stuck to it found in Buddy's bedroom. Bloodied pillows were also found here. It is believed that the pencil was used to create the small cuts to Malvina's forehead and scalp. The pencil in question seemed like a strong lead initially. Charles claimed he had never seen it before, and it was inscribed with the words White County REMC, Monticello, Indiana. It was traced back to the Rural Electric Membership Corps, who had distributed thousands of similar pencils and used them in their offices and branches. However, they were also left in the vestibule of the office building, meaning anyone could have gone inside and picked one up. This led investigators back to a dead end. The results of any testing done on the hair found with the pencil, if any was carried out, have not been made public. Other pieces of evidence found included a blood-stained towel that was discovered behind the kitchen door and a chrome towel rail that was located in the bathroom sink, leading investigators to theorize that Malvina had come to and begun to fight off her attacker before being drowned. Law enforcement had their pick when it came to suspects, as laborers were constantly going in and out of the house. At least 4 men were confirmed to be working on the Crutz family home on the day that Malvina met her end, but all 4 men were cleared after questioning, although more continued to be interviewed by police. One man, in particular, was noted to be unable to account for his whereabouts during the time of the slaying, although nothing further seems to have come from this. Several more suspects were questioned and released. None have been publicly named, and it's unclear how many there was. A hitchhiker, who was also an ex-convict from Alabama, was picked up and questioned in January, but was quickly released. A 62-year-old man was also interviewed, but neither his nor the ex-convict's prints matched those found in the Crutz family home. Local sex offenders were investigated, and in February of 1958, an unidentified woman was questioned but then released after passing a lie detector test. Police were meeting so many dead ends that they began to wonder if perhaps Malvina had acquaintances that her husband and friends did not know of. Malvina's husband, Charles, was also considered a suspect at one point. It was revealed that the 41-year-old had filed for divorce on January 13th, citing, quote, marital misconduct and gross and wanton negligence of conjugal duties, over a 10-year period. A hearing concerning a restraining order was scheduled for the 17th, but neither Charles nor Malvina turned up, leading to the divorce suit being dropped. According to Charles, the pair had decided to reconcile. Malvina's lawyer confirmed that this was true. She had apparently done the same in the early 1950s by filing for divorce before reconciling once again with her husband. The pair were due to appear in court on January 30th in regards to their earlier failure to appear in court. Charles was able to provide an alibi for the day of Malvina's demise on January 29th. He spent most of the day at his office, where he worked as a sales manager for the Southern Transportation Company, but left for 3 hours when he went to visit a friend who corroborated his story, as did the friend's landlady. Detectives were unsatisfied with this alibi, however, and asked Charles to take a polygraph test. He agreed, but asked that they do it after Malvina's funeral. One of the first police officers on the scene, James Mullen, noted several discrepancies in Charles's statements. The 48-year-old said he'd entered through the front door, but later said he'd entered through the back. He also told law enforcement officers that he'd taken off his watch and jewellery upon arriving home, but that he hadn't changed his shirt before he found the body. However, James Mullen noticed that the shirt he was wearing appeared fresh and unworn. On February 7th, Charles and his friend, Charles Fleck, both passed polygraph tests. Charles Crutz was reported to have been cooperative and keen to help, and he was questioned for a total of 4.5 hours. Another lead investigators had was that of the strange, anonymous phone calls that were repeatedly made to Malvina's husband in the days following her passing. The calls were often received at night, and a woman with a slight southern accent would ask, "Is this Mr. Crutz?" and then hang up when Charles confirmed that it was. According to Mildred Warning, the man who had answered the phone on the afternoon of January 29th had also a slight southern accent. This led police to believe that the two individuals may know each other, and that the woman possibly knew the identity of the man. They worried the unidentified man might take steps to silence the woman. Despite this, nothing more came from this lead. On February 24th, a local painter named Lenroy Pennick was brought before the municipal court in regards to the execution of Malvina Crutz. He had reportedly been uncertain about dates when he was questioned, and his account of the day was very jumbled. His polygraph showed signs of deception. His house was searched, but nothing was found. On March the 2nd, the case was dropped. 4 years later, Pennick was arrested in connection to the death of his live-in girlfriend, Carol Jean Martin. He originally said another man was responsible, but then said she'd slipped and fallen after arriving home drunk and picking a fight with him. In 1963, he was convicted of second-degree murder. Although he was questioned again about Malvina, he did not reveal anything new and denied involvement. Then, on June 12, 1958, 25-year-old James Rogers turned himself into police for forging checks and committing several armed robberies. During questioning, he claimed that his friend, who had been a painter on the Crutts property, was responsible for Malvina's demise. He later changed this story when he was questioned by Indianapolis police, saying he himself was responsible. He told the story that he'd met Malvina at a restaurant and she had invited him home. There he got mad and hit her in the side of the head with his fist. She fainted, and so he dragged her to the bathroom and placed her in the tub, turning on the cold water. When Malvina didn't come to, Rogers claimed that he left her, drove her car away, parked up, and then tossed the keys into a nearby vacant lot. Although the car was left abandoned at the same address Rogers gave, the keys were never located. Although investigators were excited about this development, they were also skeptical. Much of the information that Rogers gave was available in the newspapers, and some parts of his story simply didn't add up. A polygraph test administered by police suggested that he was lying, and Rogers then revealed that he was. He then gave investigators the name of the true culprit, and this man was investigated, only to be cleared. Rogers then gave several different names afterwards, all proving to be false leads. In total, between 200 and 250 people were interviewed in connection with the death of Malvina Crutts. Online sleuths have suggested that perhaps it was Charles, and that the man he'd gone to see earlier that day was actually his lover. This could account for why Malvina wanted a divorce. It's also been theorized that one of the laborers was responsible, but there were so many of them going in and out of the house that it muddied the investigation. Another element which severely affected the inquiry was that the case changed hands several times, and at one point was led by seriously inexperienced investigators. The final theory discussed in regards to Malvina's case is the idea that Buddy was responsible. This is due to the fact that Buddy was home for an hour and a half and didn't once use the bathroom, there was only one in his home, nor was he fazed by the wet trousers or blood-stained pillows found in his room. However, many have argued against this idea, considering Buddy was just 10 years old at the time. If he had anything to do with the attack on his mother, it seemed likely he would have gotten help from his father, as he wouldn't be able to lift or move the body on his own. However, all of this is just speculation, and we may never know the truth about Malvina Crutts' unjust slaying. To this day, her case continues to go unsolved. Camilla Lowell Lyman. Camilla, or Cam Lyman, was born September 4th, 1932, in Westwood, Massachusetts, to Arthur T. Lyman and his wife. The couple were old money Boston aristocrats who had accumulated an excessive amount of wealth via cotton mills and the cotton trade, and Arthur had spent considerable time in public service. Growing up, Cam, who later began to identify as a male, was particularly close to his father, as he shared his love for show dogs. Cam was noted to be independent and never dated or married during his lifetime, but was seen as intelligent and talented. He spent his life breeding champion show dogs. In particular, he enjoyed breeding Clumber Spaniels and Bernese Mountain Dogs, as these were his two favourite breeds. When his father died in 1968 from lung cancer, followed closely by his mother in 1973, Cam began to grow more and more reclusive and eccentric. He moved to Rhode Island sometime after the death of his mother, and around 1978 began identifying as a man, shortening the name Camilla to just Cam. Transforming his appearance via steroids and a change in wardrobe, by 1985 Cam had the standard stereotypical appearance of a man, complete with a moustache. Around this time he began to associate with a dog handler named George O'Neill, whom Cam trusted to take care of his 40-acre home and his dogs. At the time, Cam lived with nearly 60 canine friends. George made sure to feed and care for them, and he also showed the dogs at events. However, it wasn't just that Cam was a loner, or that he had little contact with his family, that made him appear bizarre and unconventional. He also went around with a briefcase filled with expensive jewelry worth thousands of dollars, and he took thousands of dollars in cash with him just to go to the shops. 2 years later, in December of 1987, Cam's family did not receive their usual Christmas card from him. They found this odd, and began to look into his lack of correspondence. That's when they noticed they hadn't seen or heard from Cam in months. Checks that had been sent to Cam were being endorsed with a Rhode Island account number instead of his signature. The family notified authorities of Cam's disappearance. They also contacted the law firm in charge of his trust, and a private investigator named Charles Allen was hired and sent to investigate the matter. Charles uncovered that Cam's caretaker and sole confidant, George O'Neill, had been depositing the 54-year-old's trust fund checks into his own account, and also that he held Cam's power of attorney and stood to inherit $2.5 million from Cam's estate. Authorities questioned O'Neill in regards to Cam's disappearance, and were told that, earlier that summer, the pair had fought over the phone about the dogs, and that O'Neill's employer had hung up on him. The next day, when O'Neill went over to the home, he found the phone ripped out of the wall, and the doors wide open. O'Neill claimed that he believed Cam had gone to Europe to get sexual reassignment surgery. However, he could not provide any proof of this. He also couldn't explain why, for 6 months, he had failed to report Cam as a missing person. Not only this, but O'Neill then refused to allow law enforcement to search the property. He continued to show Cam's dogs as his own, and he somehow continued to keep cashing Cam's checks. Reportedly, much of Cam's cash had dwindled. Between 3 and 5 million of it was gone. Meanwhile, PI Charles Allen did not believe that Cam had gone for the operation because the 54-year-old man was afraid of going to the dentists and doctors. His sister Mary added that she didn't believe he would leave his faithful, beloved dogs behind. Cam was declared dead in absentia in 1995. Then in 1997, a decade after his disappearance, Cam's body was found in the septic tank of his property in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. The new owners of the house had found the remains when they noticed a strange smell emanating from the sewer. In 1998, the medical examiner confirmed that the remains were Cam's by using his dental records. It was determined that he had been killed around the time that he went missing. In 2003, George O'Neill was indicted for embezzling $15,000 from Cam's estate. He was sentenced to 1 year of probation and ordered to pay $450 in court costs. He died in 2011 without providing any further information on Cam's death. The family challenged O'Neill's claim to Cam's fortune, and in the end, he ended up with the house worth $40,000, while the Lyman family received everything else. Many people suspect that George O'Neill was involved in the death of his employer, while others have proposed the theory that someone who had heard about Cam living alone with an abundance of cash and jewels had attempted a robbery that had gone wrong. If this was the case, however, why would they bother disposing of the body? In June of 1999, the show Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about Cam's disappearance and tragic end. Reportedly, after it aired, investigators received several new leads. Charles Allen was still on the case at the time, and told the press that the new information, quote, could be a break in the case. However, it's unknown what exactly this information was, and since then, no one has ever been charged in relation to Cam's homicide. Doreen Picard. In 1982, 22-year-old Doreen Picard and 27-year-old Susan Laferte lived in the same apartment complex in Woonsocket. Doreen was studying childhood development in university and lived alone in one of the upstairs apartments. Meanwhile, Susan was a housewife and member of the local neighborhood watch. She and her husband Ernie were the landlords of the apartment building and had 2 children together. On February 19th, 1982, Doreen began packing up her belongings as she was due to move out of her apartment. Downstairs, Susan had lunch with her sister Carol in her home. At around 1:30 p.m., two friends of Susan's arrived. While Carol recognized one of the men who turned up at the door, she did not know the other. Susan told Carol that the men planned to look at the puppies she was selling. She talked to them for a few minutes, and then they left. At 1:45 p.m, Carol left the apartment too. Sometime after this, both Doreen and Susan were downstairs in the basement doing laundry when an unidentified man entered the basement and began to attack both women with a 28-inch lead pipe. At 3:20 p.m, another tenant of the complex found Susan's 3-year-old daughter Nicole in the hallway. She had been locked out of her home. When the tenant asked where her mother was, Nicole told him that she was in the basement, which is when the two bodies of Susan and Doreen were discovered. Tragically, Doreen Pickard passed away from the injuries she had sustained. She had apparently been strangled with her own sweatshirt, leading many to believe that she was the target of the attack. Susan, on the other hand, suffered a severe head injury and went into surgery for 2 hours. She fell into a coma afterwards. Fearing for her safety, police guarded Susan's room around the clock. 30 days later, Susan awoke. She had no memory of the attack or the person who had attacked her. The last day that she remembered was December 31st, 1981. 3-year-old Nicole was the only one who could describe her mother's assailant. She told her grandmother that she had let him into the building thinking he was a friend of her mother's. She said she saw him before he left and that he had a lead pipe and a bloody white handkerchief in his pocket. However, due to Nicole's young age, her testimony could not be used. She described the man as having a moustache, a hat with a visor, wearing jeans and trainers, and mentioned that he was taller than her father. It is possible that this description is inaccurate given Nicole's young age at the time. The lead pipe was found in the building 4 days later. Law enforcement believed that the perpetrator had chosen his victim based on newspaper ads. Possibly he saw that Doreen's apartment was for rent, or that Susan was selling puppies. But they could not determine whether or not the women knew their attacker, or whether he was a stranger. While the police hunted for clues, Doreen's parents conducted their own informal investigation. They received several anonymous calls during the course of their inquiry telling them to stop digging for information. The caller threatened to hurt the Pickard's family and to burn down Mr. Pickard's repair shop. Nonetheless, the family continued to search for answers, although, in the end, answers eluded them. Almost a decade later, in June of 1991, 38-year-old Raymond D. Tempest Jr. was arrested and charged with the slaying of Doreen Pickard. He could not be charged with the attack on Susan since the statute of limitations had run out. Tempest was the son of the chief inspector of the Woonsocket Police Department and also had a brother who was a lieutenant in the force. Investigators learned that Tempest had been having an affair with Susan around the time of the attack. He was one of the two men who had visited her apartment earlier that day in regards to the puppies being sold. According to the detectives on the case, Tempest had been a suspect from the start, but they didn't have any evidence to back up their suspicions. However, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries in May of 1988, which featured the case, had brought forward several witnesses. These 4 witnesses claimed that Tempest had bragged about and confessed to the crime. He also reportedly threatened some of them, telling them not to tell anyone or he'd hurt them. He'd also allegedly claimed that his connections in the police department would mean that he would get away with it. A car, seen at the crime scene, also resembled one that Tempest's brother-in-law owned. The prosecution's witnesses added that he was seen with fresh bite and scratch marks on his wrists after the attack, and that he asked for alibis during the time of the slaying. The police believed that the pair got into an argument that turned violent, and that Doreen had walked in and tried to help, resulting in her death. They also believed that Tempest's brother, Gordon, had helped conceal the crime. In April of 1992, Tempest was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 85 years in prison. His brother Gordon was convicted of perjury. Prosecutors also claimed that the Tempest family had helped intimidate witnesses into not coming forward. In 2014, The Innocence Project caught wind of the case when Tempest reached out seeking help to clear his name. The Innocence Project believed that he had been arrested and convicted as a result of coercion of witnesses by corrupt policemen and overzealous prosecutors. Tempest believed that the Woonsocket Police Department knew who was really behind the crimes, but had covered it up and set him as the foreman. According to Tempest, the real perpetrator was a man named Donald DeGessie, who died in 2011. He's not the only one who thinks so. Susan's daughter, Nicole, pointed out DeGessie as her mother's attacker when they attended Doreen's funeral. Reportedly, after Susan woke from her coma, she identified DeGessie, but later said she couldn't remember who her attacker was. That same year, Tempest's 2014 request for help clearing his name via DNA testing was not accepted by the courts. The testing was to be carried out on the hairs found on Doreen's hands. They have since been confirmed as not coming from Tempest. However, investigators have argued that they could have come from the laundry room floor. In 2015, Tempest's conviction was vacated by a judge based on the alleged misconduct and unreliability of witnesses brought forward. Today, many people believe that Tempest was set up. It's been pointed out that Nicole had told her family about Donald, but that she had not reacted in any way to seeing Tempest, despite the fact that she saw him several times after her mother's attack. It's also been said that DeGessie had made several incriminating statements to Susan's sister-in-law, and that a woman, who had received a phone call in which an anonymous person confessed to the case, identified the man's voice as DeGessie's. Also, in 1987, Gordon Tempest was involved in a bust and arrested a known criminal named Stanley Isra. Isra was coincidentally the brother of one of the investigators on Susan and Doreen's case, giving them a possible motive to frame Raymond Tempest in revenge. The officer claimed that his informant had led him to Raymond Tempest's door, but it's been argued that the investigator's informant was actually Isra. Yet another flaw in the prosecution's case was that one of the witnesses constantly contradicted her own statements, including saying that Tempest had brought a puppy home to his children and that they were really excited about it, except that the witness did not even know the family. Also, Tempest had not kept the puppy, he had given it to a friend who'd gone to Susan's with him. This witness also claimed that Gordon had hidden the pipe to cover up for his brother, but she previously claimed that Gordon had no knowledge of the crime. The 4 witnesses brought in for the prosecution were noted to have been vulnerable due to their involvement with drugs, drug trafficking, and sex work. In 2017, the state planned to retry Tempest, but in December of that year, he entered an Alford plea, which meant that he maintained his innocence, but agreed that there was enough evidence to lead to a conviction. He was released from prison as a result, and the case is considered closed, but many feel that the real killer of Doreen Pickard has escaped unpunished. Beverly Potts. Beverly Rose Potts was born on April 15, 1941, in Cleveland, Ohio, to Elizabeth and Robert Potts. She had one older sister named Anita, and the foursome lived together on Linnet Avenue in 1951. 10 years old at this time, Beverly was described as a shy, quiet, and responsible girl. She had a strong interest in the performing arts and was a trusted babysitter despite her young age, and tended to avoid interacting with strangers as much as possible, due to her shy and fearful nature. On August 24, 1951, at around 7 p.m, Beverly, along with her friend and neighbour Patsy Swing, took her bike and headed along to Halloran Park, which was less than a quarter of a mile from where the girls lived. The pair had been given permission to visit a show-a-gon, a children's performance event that took place in the park every summer. This was a special treat for the girls, because the park was generally considered unsafe after dark. It was often filled with drifters, and the trees tended to block any light filtering from the streets and the stars above. At 8 p.m, the girls decided that the park would be much easier to maneuver if they didn't have their bikes, so they returned home to drop them off before heading back to the park. 45 minutes later, Patsy Swing suggested to Beverly that they begin the trip home, as Patsy had a 9 p.m. curfew. However, Beverly didn't need to be home until after 9, so she decided to stay in the park alone. Patsy left. She last saw Beverly in amongst the crowd watching the on-stage performance. At 9:30 p.m, the show ended, and people began to empty out of the park. A 13-year-old boy who knew Beverly saw her heading diagonally across the park in a northeastern direction, about 150 yards from the corner of Linnet Avenue and West 117th Street. This made sense, as it was the quickest route home for the 10-year-old, and she would, when she reached the street, be just minutes away from her front door. Reportedly, the boy recognized Beverly by her distinct, quote, duck-like gait, as she walked with her toes pointed outward. Several witnesses claimed to have seen a girl who looked like Beverly near a black, battered 1937 Dodge, which was idling on West 117th Street. Inside the car were 2 men, to whom the girl was speaking. Witnesses placed this encounter between 8:30 and 9:30 p.m. The girl never entered the car at any point during these sightings. It's worth noting that Beverly was extremely shy around strangers, especially men, and would often flee rather than speak with them. So it seems odd that she would stop and talk to 2 unknown men in a car, if the girl was the soon-to-be missing 10-year-old. It's possible that perhaps she knew the men, or that the girl wasn't Beverly at all. Beverly did not return home. At 10 p.m, her family began to search for her, but they had no luck and decided to contact the police department. The authorities launched a large search to find the missing girl, but found no trace. In the days following her disappearance, they went door to door canvassing the neighborhood and nearby areas. They traced suspicious cars, they searched in empty parking lots, and they used a plane to survey open railway cars. All of these efforts, however, proved fruitless. The case received extensive media coverage, which led to thousands of tips flooding the local police department. The family, including Anita, Beverly's 22-year-old sister, was cleared of any and all involvement in the disappearance. It was determined by investigators that Beverly had a stable life, was happy and well cared for, and had no apparent reason to run away, making it seem likely that she had been abducted. Shortly after her disappearance, her father's union offered a $1,000 reward, the equivalent of nearly $15,000 today. It was speculated that, given the 10-year-old's aversion to strangers, she had been perhaps lured into the home or car of someone she knew, maybe on the promise of a babysitting gig, or someone claiming they needed help running errands, or were ready to drive her home. This made it seem likely she was taken by someone local to the neighborhood. However, the only documented search of any nearby buildings was that of a search carried out in 1973 in the basement of what was then an auto shop. No evidence connected to Beverly's case was ever uncovered, however. There was also no plausible local suspect discovered in the months and years following the 10-year-old's disappearance. Another proposed theory was that although Beverly had been strongly warned against strange men, she hadn't been warned the same way about women, leading many to wonder if she was perhaps lured away by an unknown female. Although Beverly's case largely grew cold in the years following her disappearance, and leads have become scarce, there have been several suspects and confessions related to her vanishing. In 1955, a vagrant named Harvey Lee Rush told law enforcement in California that he had killed Beverly after luring her to a nearby bridge with sweets. However, he claimed to have killed her in 1952, a year after her disappearance, leaving 12 months unaccounted for. When he was extradited back to Cleveland, Rush admitted that he had lied, simply so he could return home to Cleveland. In 1980, 2 retired Cleveland detectives named James Forrest and Robert Shankland revealed that they knew the identity of the killer. According to them, in 1974, they were approached by a man who claimed his brother had sent him a letter admitting to the crime. His brother had fled Cleveland in 1966 after being charged with the abduction of 2 young girls. The brother was located by detectives and questioned, and he told them that he'd been living near the park in 1951 and made a habit of abducting young girls and sexually abusing them. He claimed that he didn't remember abducting Beverly in particular, but that he had flashes of memory involving a girl named Beverly. The detectives had been certain of his guilt ever since, but even with the letter that appeared to explain all, a lack of evidence meant that he was never charged in connection with Beverly's case. Another suspect in the disappearance of Beverly Potts was a man named William Henry Redmond, an Ohio native and former carnival worker. Redmond was indicted in 1988 for the murder of an 8-year-old girl in Pennsylvania in 1951. While in prison, he boasted about how he'd killed other young girls, but when he was questioned by authorities about Beverly, he refused to make a statement. Redmond was in the area at the time of the vanishing and had a record of child abuse convictions, which dated back to 1935, when he was just 13 years old. Despite the age of the case, it continued to turn up leads in the 1990s and 2000s. In 1994, a letter was found under the carpet of a Cleveland house in which a woman claimed that her husband had killed Beverly and that she caught him attempting to dispose of the body in their furnace. This letter had been written in 1960 and was found in a house on Midvale Avenue. The author of the letter was tracked down using real estate records, and she was 83 years old by the time she was traced in 1994. Her husband was already dead, and the woman admitted that the claims in the letter were false. She had written it as a revenge fantasy against her abusive husband. Then, starting in 2000, a reporter named Brent Larkin, who worked at the Cleveland Plain Dealer, a local paper, began to receive letters pertaining to the case. The writer claimed he was an elderly man who wanted to confess to sexually abusing and killing Beverly before his death. He said he would turn himself in on the 50th anniversary of Beverly's disappearance, on August 24, 2001. But he never did. He wrote another letter to apologize for this, claiming he had been moved to a nursing home and wouldn't be able to honor his promise. Brent Larkin received 4 letters in total, with 2 containing details of the abduction and the slaying. One letter promised a sealed brown envelope and a rare coin that Beverly had had in her purse the night she disappeared. These items were promised to Brent, but he has, as of 2020, yet to receive them. Authorities established that these letters were written by one person, likely an elderly, infirm man. However, they were never able to establish his identity. Some investigators believe that these interactions were genuine. In August of 2019, an unidentified person anonymously provided information about a suspect in the case. The police have checked this caller's information and it all seems to add up, but they have stated that they need more information and have asked the same caller to please contact them again. The Crime Stoppers reward has been upped from $2,500 to $15,000. The eerie case of Beverly Potts has inspired multiple books and documentaries and is still being investigated nearly 70 years later. Anyone with any information is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers at 216-252-7463. As of today, the mysterious and tragic case of Beverly Potts continues to go unsolved. The Fort Worth Trio. Christmas 1974 should have been a joyous occasion, filled with love and laughter. But for 3 families in Fort Worth, Texas, there was a terrible tragedy which filled their days with grief and sadness. In December of 1974, Mary Rachel Trelica, who went by her middle name, was 17 years old. Rachel attended Southwest High School, and she'd been married for 6 months to Tommy Trelica, a handsome 21-year-old who had already been divorced and had a 2-year-old child. The couple had met when Tommy had been dating Rachel's 19-year-old sister, Deborah. Deborah and Tommy had been briefly engaged, but according to Deborah, the engagement was never serious and the split had been amicable. At the time of Rachel's disappearance, Deborah had temporarily moved in with her sister and brother-in-law, having recently fallen out with her own boyfriend. On December 23, 1974, Rachel and her 14-year-old friend Lisa Renee Wilson, who also went by her middle name, planned to go Christmas shopping at the Seminary South Shopping Center, now known as the Fort Worth Town Center. In the morning, Renee went to her boyfriend's house to see if he wanted to come with them. Terry Mosley was 15 years old and lived nearby. During this meeting, he gave Renee a promise ring. The couple planned to attend a festive party later on that night. While Terry was unable to go, as he had prior commitments, his younger sister, Julie, who was just 9, overheard the conversation and asked if she could come instead. She didn't want to spend the day alone. Rachel and Renee were hesitant about allowing a 9-year-old to tag along and told her she could only do so if she got her mother's permission. Julie excitedly phoned her mother, Rayanne, to ask if she could go, but was told she couldn't as she didn't have any money. Rayanne later added that she didn't know Rachel, although she knew Renee, so initially didn't want her daughter to go on the trip. However, Julie continued to beg to be allowed to go, claiming she had no one else to play with, and her mother eventually relented but told her to be home by 6 p.m. This would be fine, as Rachel and Renee intended to be home by 4, so Renee could get ready for the party with Terry. The trio piled into Rachel's 1972 Oldsmobile 98. They drove to the Army-Navy store in Fort Worth, where Renee had some layaway items to collect. They then carried on to the shopping center at 4200 South Freeway in South Fort Worth. From this point on, however, the details of what the girls did becomes hazy. When none of the girls arrived home, their families quickly grew concerned. Some remained home in case the girls showed up, while others headed to the shopping center. Around 6 p.m, Rachel's Oldsmobile was discovered, locked, parked in the Sears upper level parking lot. It looked as if the girls had, at some point, made it back to the car, as there were a few gift items inside. The family waited by the car all night, desperately hoping for their return. However, the girls never came back. The next morning, the Fort Worth police were informed about the disappearance, and a search to locate the 3 girls was launched. Searchers combed through hundreds of back roads, creek beds, country roads, and the Texas brush, looking for any sign of life, but it never came. It didn't take long for the case to be handed over to the Youth Division of the Missing Persons Bureau, but the girls, for some reason, were deemed to be runaways. The families of each girl heavily disputed this. Renee's mother asked why Julie, a 9-year-old girl, would run away 2 days before Christmas. She also noted that her own daughter was very excited about the party she was supposed to attend the evening she went missing. Despite their frustrations with the authorities, the families of the missing trio handed out flyers and contacted newspapers across the country, desperately seeking help. This led to the case being well publicized, and tips and witness statements began flooding in. Around this time, a store clerk came forward to claim that an old woman had told her she had witnessed the girls being forced into a pickup truck near the Buddy's grocery store at the mall. The truck was never found, and neither was the witness, so the story could never be verified. The eeriest clue, however, came on December 24, 1972, just 1 day after the girls went missing, when Rachel's husband, Tommy, received a letter in the mail. It read as follows, quote, "I know I'm going to catch it, but we had to get away. We're going to Houston. See you in about a week. The car is in the Sears upper lot. Love, Rachel." The letter was written in ink, while the envelope had been written on in pencil, and the sheet of paper was much wider than the envelope. The name Rachel was written on the top left corner of the envelope. But that's not all. It was addressed to Thomas, despite the fact that Rachel always called her husband Tommy, and it looked like Rachel's name had initially been misspelt. The L in her name was written as a lowercase e, and then gone over again to be corrected to an L. Neither Tommy nor Rachel's other family members believed that the 17-year-old had written the letter. The main clue gathered from the letter was the postmark, which contained no city, only a blurred postcode. It looked like it had read, quote, 76083, but that the 3 appeared backwards, possibly by a hand-loaded stamp, or perhaps it was a partial 8. It is assumed that the postcode is either 76083, which leads back to Eliasville near Throckmorton in Texas, or 76088, which is from Weatherford in Texas. Despite this information, no new leads appeared to emerge. During the 70s and 80s, the letter was subject to handwriting analysis. Even the FBI looked at it multiple times, but each time the letter was examined, the results came back as inconclusive. Reportedly, a week after the letter's arrival, the police told a local newspaper that the handwriting had been verified as Rachel's, but she may have been forced to write it. Then, in 1978, 6 years after the disappearances, police refuted these claims, stating that the results were inconclusive and always had been. By the spring of 1975, the family were growing frustrated by the efforts of the police and hired a private investigator named John Swaim. In April that year, Swaim and 100 volunteers went to the Texas city of Port Lavaca to search under bridges after he received a tip that the girls had been killed and dumped there, but no evidence was found to indicate that this was true. Later that year, in August, Swaim discovered that a 28-year-old man was making obscene phone calls in the area, and that this same man had worked for a South Fort Worth store where Rachel had applied for a job just before Christmas. Reportedly, this man, whose name does not emerge in online articles, had been abusing his position, gathering the information of women who had applied for jobs there, or who were listed as references on job applications. 6 women who'd handed in job applications were receiving the lewd phone calls. It's also noted that this man lived in the same neighborhood as Rachel's parents, but he moved away shortly before she married. Although this seemed like a promising lead, nothing ever came of it, and the man was never linked in relation to the trio's disappearance. Also in 1975, a young man claiming to be an acquaintance of Rachel's said he saw the trio in the record department store in the mall on the day they vanished. He claimed the girls were there with another person, and that he and Rachel spoke briefly. Around this time, women's clothing was located in the Justin area of Texas, but the items were found to not belong to the missing girls. A year later, in 1976, 3 skeletons were located in a field outside Alvord, Texas, by an oil drilling crew. The PI, Swaim, did have the remains compared to x-rays and dental records of the missing girl, but no match was made between them. It was later found that the remains were of 2 females and 1 male, aged between 15 and 17. In March of that same year, a psychic called one of the missing girls' family members and said that they could be found near an oil well. Desperate for any potential lead, searchers focused on a small oil drilling community named Rising Star, but this turned up nothing. Just a few short years later, in 1979, the case was plunged into darkness again when John Swaim died of a drug overdose, thought to have been brought on by his failing marriage. The death was ruled as suicide, and upon his death, he had ordered that all his case files be destroyed. And so they were. In the spring of 1981, police were called to a location in Brazoria County, Texas, when human remains were found in a swampy area. After a month of investigation, it was discovered that the bones did not match those of the missing trio. That same year, a witness came forward to claim that he saw a man in the parking lot of the shopping center forcing a girl into his van, but the witness was told by the man that it was a family dispute. This story was never verified by authorities. After this, the case grew cold. In 2001, it was reopened and assigned to a homicide detective who believes that the girls left with someone they trusted and that more than one person was involved. In April of that year, a man named Bill Hutchins came forward. He was a security guard for the shopping mall's Sears outlet at the time of the girls' disappearance. According to Bill, he was working the late shift on December 23, 1972, when another guard in a pickup truck appeared around 1:30 p.m. The two exchanged harsh words, although it's unknown why. Bill reportedly saw 3 girls sitting in the front seat of the truck, with the youngest sitting next to the driver, and the oldest sitting next to the door. The man apologized for his language and drove off. Bill noted that the 3 girls were smiling and laughing and appeared to be there voluntarily. He claimed to have reported it at the time, but that no one ever got back to him. In the 2001 reopening of the case, however, this sighting was investigated, as was the other security guard who denied having anything to do with the girls. It was revealed that multiple people were being investigated as a part of the girls' disappearance. The most recent development in the case came in 2018, when 2 cars were pulled out of Benbrook Lake, Texas. The cars were suspected of having some connection to the trio's disappearance, but no forensic evidence was linked back to the girls. Several articles mention a 3rd car, also submerged in the lake, which is being looked into, but there has been little to no information or updates since. During the 1990s, Rachel's brother, Rusty, gained a lot of attention when he and a private investigator named Dan James began working together. In 2000, the pair proposed the idea that Rachel, and Rachel alone, was still alive, and that she visited Fort Worth every Christmas. Dan James added that someone was, quote, shrouding and manufacturing evidence to keep her away. Rachel and Rusty's mother, Fran, blamed the PI for, quote, poisoning Rusty's mind, and Rusty fell out with his family due to his strange behaviour and obsessive need to try and solve the case. He even demanded that his older sister, Deborah, take a polygraph test. A tragic example of the way these cases tear families apart. Fortunately, however, in recent years the family has reunited. In the days following his wife's disappearance, Tommy put up a $2,000 reward for information leading to her whereabouts, but after a year, he left Fort Worth, took up a supervisory role at a Texas water company, and remarried. Renee's father continues to search for answers, although her mother, Judy, died in 2015 without any. Julie's mother also passed away in 2013 without ever knowing her daughter's fate. If alive today, Rachel would be 63, Renee would be 60, and Julie would be 55. If you have any information about the fate of these 3 girls, you can contact the Fort Worth Police Department at 817-469-8477. Jeanette De Palma. Jeanette Christine De Palma was born on August 3, 1956, in Jersey City, New Jersey. By all accounts, Jeanette was a regular middle-class girl, if not rather religious. She came from a large Italian family and was one of 5 daughters born to Salvador and Florence De Palma. She also had 3 brothers. There were some reports that Jeanette and her older sister, Gwendolyn, had drug issues that were fixed when the family converted to the Church of God. She was known to be involved in community work that aided drug addicts, and she had intentions of attending Bible college. Although she was seen by some to be a girl on the straight and narrow, Jeanette was described by others as something of a wild child. Some even noted that her religious stance was something that her parents believed in and cared about, but not necessarily what she believed in or what she cared about. Jeanette was 16 years old and working at a clothing store in August of 1972. On Monday the 17th, she left her home on Clearview Road in Springfield Township, New Jersey, telling her mother that she was taking the train to a friend's house. When she didn't arrive at her friend's place or come home that night, her parents alerted the local police department and filed a missing persons report. 6 weeks later, on September 19th, a decomposed body was found in the cliffside of Springfield's quarry. It was discovered when a local dog water's pet brought the body's forearm to its owner. Several witnesses to the gruesome scene claimed that the skeletal remains, which were found face down, were surrounded by strange and possibly occult objects. Descriptions from onlookers vary, but the most common statement is that the body was found inside a coffin-shaped perimeter made of branches and logs. Within this were makeshift wooden crosses. Other Springfield residents claimed that the body was found lying on a pentagram and that it was surrounded by the mutilated corpses of animals. However, this claim has been denied by local law enforcement. The cliff where the body was found was known to locals for several decades as the Devil's Teeth, adding to the idea that this case was wrapped up in witchcraft. The body was identified as Jeanette's using her dental records. She still had on her tan trousers, navy shirt and flip-flops, the clothes she was last seen wearing. The autopsy, unfortunately, did not reveal much to the authorities. Her remains and clothing showed no signs of bone fractures, bullet wounds or knife wounds, and no drug paraphernalia was found on or near the body. Unusually high amounts of lead were found in the remains, but this could not be explained by the coroner or authorities. Although it's unclear why, the coroner suspected that the 16-year-old girl had died from strangulation, leading law enforcement to launch a homicide investigation that was short-lived and, honestly, lacking in effort. Early on in the investigation into Jeanette's callous slaying, law enforcement received a tip regarding a homeless man living in the woods near where the body was located. The drifter was known to locals as Red, and he allegedly fled his camp in the woods after Jeanette's disappearance. While this does seem like a lead that may have been worth investigating, the Union County's prosecutor's office quickly determined that Red had nothing to do with Jeanette's case. It's unknown how they came to this decision. Despite this setback, investigators continued to look into the case. However, it wasn't long before leads began to dry up, its cold case status exacerbated by the fact that none of Jeanette's friends and acquaintances gave consistent information in regards to her lifestyle. 2 weeks after Jeanette's body was found, newspapers, including the Star-Ledger and the New York Daily Times, began to report that she was perhaps a victim of occult sacrifice, a practice that was possibly carried out by Satanists or a local coven operating in the nearby Watchung Reservation, a nature reserve in Union City, New Jersey. Rumors swirled about Jeanette and her demise, and whisperings about the Watchung Reservation continued long after her case grew cold. In the late 90s and early 2000s, a magazine named Weird NJ began receiving anonymous letters regarding Jeanette's case. The editor and co-founder, a man named Mark Moran, began investigating the case, noting odd details, like allegations that the Springfield Police Department had lost or destroyed the case file. In regard to this, the police department maintained that the file was lost due to the flooding that occurred as a result of 1999's Hurricane Floyd. However, unknown sources allege that there is still a copy of the file in existence. Mark Moran went on to team up with one of his magazine's correspondents, Jesse Pollock, to write a book about the case. Their research led them to conclude that there was the possibility of a cover-up, that the case had connections to other unsolved cases, and that there were multiple previously unknown suspects. In an article on the Weird NJ website which discusses the case and the book written about it, it's noted that no one who was interviewed by the authors in connection with the case was willing to go on record or have their name published. Not even law enforcement. The general consensus of locals was that the killer was still at large, the crime was cult-related, and that somehow the police were involved in covering up the crime. Testing of Jeanette's clothing in 1973 revealed that no drugs or poisons were found on her blouse, trousers, or underwear. No foreign hairs were found either. However, stains in her underwear, bra, blouse, and trousers were found, but they could not be used for blood or semen examinations because they were too badly degraded. The original patrolman who found the body, Donald Schwerdt, has told news outlets that he doesn't buy into the occult theory, stating his belief that Jeanette passed away from a drug overdose. Some online sleuths also share this belief, suspecting that the occult themes of the case were simply a red herring. It is not uncommon for so-called occult practices to be labelled the culprit in cases where, in truth, there is little evidence for such accusations. Other people, however, including Jeanette's nephew, believe she met her end at the hands of someone else. In 2019, a Union County judge rejected the request to perform DNA tests on Jeanette's clothing. This request came from a retired private investigator who filed a lawsuit in an attempt to pressure the Union County Prosecutor's Office to test the clothing. The request was denied because the private investigator couldn't bring the suit as he had, quote, no legal relationship with De Palma, her estate, or anyone else who may have a stake in the outcome of the case. The unsolved mystery of Jeanette's case is still open, and many hope that there will one day be answers to a case that feels shrouded in uncertainty. Anyone with any information can contact Lieutenant Jose Vandas at 908-358-3048. Charles Walton. Charles Walton was born to Charles and Emma Walton on May 12, 1870. He was an agricultural worker who'd lived his entire life in Lower Quinton, a civil parish in Warwickshire in the United Kingdom. In 1945, Charles was a widower, having lost his wife in 1927 and lived with his niece, Edith Isabel Walton, who was 33 years old. After her mother passed away in 1915, when she was just 3, Charles had taken her in. Although Charles was solitary and seen as an eccentric man, he was also looked upon fondly, with many describing him as polite and pleasant. He garnered a reputation for himself of a man who was good with dogs and even better with horses. He was somewhat reclusive and did not actively socialise, but he had no feuds with anyone in the village, nor had he any ill will towards anyone. For the last 9 months prior to his demise in February of 1945, he had been working for a local farmer named Alfred Potter. Charles worked the farm when it wasn't raining and picked his own hours due to his health condition. He suffered from arthritis. He often worked around 4 days a week. On Valentine's Day of 1945, Charles headed out as normal with his pitchfork and slash hook. Witnesses saw him make his way through the churchyard between 9 and 9:30 a.m. On this particular day, Charles's job was to slash hedges in a field known as Hill Ground on the slopes of Meehan Hill. Meanwhile, his niece, Edith, was working as a printer assembler at the Royal Society of Arts. She expected Charles to be home at around 4 p.m. However, when Edith returned home at 6, she quickly realised her uncle wasn't there. Given his solitary habits, she did not believe that Charles was simply out at the pub or with a friend, so she went next door to the house of her neighbour and they together made their way to the farm where Charles worked. Charles's employer, Alfred Potter, told Edith that he had seen her uncle that day slashing the hedges. They set off to the area where Potter had last seen his employee, and the trio discovered the mutilated body of 74-year-old Charles Walton. A sight so horrific that Edith could not stop screaming and had to be led away by her neighbour. Another man who was passing was asked to alert the authorities, while Alfred Potter stood to guard the body until police arrived. This crime scene was gruesome. Charles had been beaten with his own walking cane, his neck cut with the slash hook, the weapon still buried in the wound. The prongs of the pitchfork pinned him to the ground, either side of his neck. His shirt was ripped open, his fly was open, and his trousers were unfastened. Some articles about the case also report that there was a cross carved into his chest, although the coroner's report does not mention any such thing. The wait for authorities was long. While the first policeman, P.C. Lomersney, arrived on the scene at 7:05 p.m, members of the Stratford-upon-Avon CID did not arrive until much later. Professor Webster of the West Midlands Forensic Laboratory did not show up until 11:30 p.m. Charles's body was finally moved from the field at 1:30 in the morning. The following day, Potter was questioned by authorities. He stated that he had lived on the farm for 5 years and had known Charles all that time, although he had only recently become his employer in the last 9 months. He told police about Charles's habit of having lunch at 11 AM and then working through till 4. During the morning of February 14th, Potter had been at the local pub, the College Arms, with another farmer until noon. Soon, the police requested help from Scotland Yard. They requested that they bring an Italian translator, as they believed the perpetrator was possibly one of the men being held at the nearby Italian and German prison camp that had been set up at the start of the war. Scotland Yard sent Chief Inspector Robert Fabian and Detective Sergeant Albert Webb to assist with the investigation. The pair arrived on February 16th, accompanied by D.S. Saunders, who spoke fluent Italian. Alfred Potter quickly became the investigators' prime suspect. They asked the first policeman on the scene, who knew the Potters well, to keep a close eye on the couple in case they said or did anything incriminating. Saunders meanwhile interrogated some of the Italians at the nearby camp, which was more of a free-roam prison than anything, where inhabitants could come and go as they pleased. However, none of the men there ever became serious suspects. Charles's post-mortem revealed that his trachea had been cut, with bruising to his chest and several broken ribs. He also had defensive wounds, cuts to his left hand and bruising on the back of his right hand and forearm. The time of his death was estimated between 1 and 2 p.m. A few days later, on February 20th, P.C. Lomersnay mentioned to Potter that the police were hoping to get fingerprints from the weapons. Potter replied that he had handled the weapons and had told the authorities as such. He had touched them because Harry Beasley, Edith's neighbour, had told him to check that Charles was dead. Potter also told P.C. Lomersnay that the slaying of Charles was, quote, the work of a fascist man from the camp. A short time later, a serviceman arrived at the farm and told Potter and Lomersnay that an Italian had been detained by military police, sparking giddiness and glee in Potter and his wife, something which the PC found deeply suspicious. Authorities took statements from over 500 Lower Quinton residents. They also brought in Royal Engineers who used mine detectors to search the area in an attempt to find Charles's missing pocket watch. On the day after his body was found, authorities had sent out a description of his pocket watch to jewelers and pawnbrokers, but it was not located. No clues were found while utilizing the mine detectors. Chief Inspector Robert Fabian believed Alfred Potter was the culprit for several reasons. Potter left the crime scene just as the police started arriving. He had previously been complaining about the cold, but P.C. Lomersnay believed that he appeared more worried and anxious than anything else. Potter also claimed that he would have gone to see Charles on the day he died, but he had to attend to a calf who was stuck in a nearby ditch. However, authorities learned that the calf had actually died the day before Charles's attack. Potter had also made several statements about when he'd last seen Charles working, and the statements changed every time. First, he said he'd seen him working at a distance at 12:10, then 12:15, then 12:20, ultimately saying he'd seen someone at 12:30 p.m. Law enforcement also noticed that they had no notes about him telling them that he had handled the weapons. Harry Beasley refuted the claims that he'd told Potter to check whether Charles was dead because it was obvious that he was. He also added that Potter did not touch the weapons while in his presence. Despite all this information, the police could not find a real motive, and they did not uncover any solid, damning evidence. 2 former workers of Potter's stated that he sometimes had difficulty paying their wages, leading some to believe that there was perhaps a dispute between Potter and Charles over money. Edith told authorities that she had not heard Charles say that he had lent anyone money and had not seen any IOUs. Without any evidence to back up this idea that Charles was owed money, or of any dispute between him and his employer, the authorities hit a dead end. The village of Lower Quinton has always been rife with tales of paganism and witchcraft. It is said that the devil attempted to throw a large clod of earth to smother the recently built abbey in the town, but that the Bishop of Worcester noticed, and with the power of prayer, he altered the devil's aim, causing the earth to fall short of the abbey, which led to form Meehan Hill, the very place where Charles's body was found. These stories remained just as prevalent in 1945 as they were in prior centuries. Only 1 year before the slaying of Charles Walton, a high-profile trial took place in Lower Quinton of a woman named Helen Duncan, who said she could summon spirits, which breached 1735's Witchcraft Act. For some time before his death, rumours had circulated about Charles. Some villagers were suspicious of him, believing that he used toads to sabotage the previous year's harvest, whilst others noted his unnatural affinity with animals. We have already discussed Charles's affinity with dogs and horses, but the whisperings said he could tame wild beasts, and that birds would feed from his hand and avoid eating the seeds from his land at his request. A book named Folklore, Old Customs and Traditions in Shakespeare Land, which was published in 1929, told of a Charles Walton who, in 1885, had seen a phantom black dog on the road while walking home for several consecutive nights. On the final night, he'd seen the dog with a headless woman. Upon returning home, he found that his sister had passed away. Black dogs have long since been a part of British folklore, signifying death and having satanic associations. It is pointed out, however, that there are no records to show that Charles had a sister who died in 1885. In the 1970s, when Chief Inspector Robert Fabian wrote his own autobiography, he referred to the Charles Walton case as the witchcraft murder, and said that the case was clearly the ghostly climax of a pagan rite. He also stated that he had an encounter with a black dog on Meehan Hill one evening. Although there are reports that a black dog was strung up next to Charles's body, these are unsubstantiated. 15 miles from Lower Quinton, an 80-year-old woman named Anne Tennant, living in Long Compton, was brutally slain in 1875. Rumour has it that she was killed in the exact same manner that Charles was, but this has since been disproven. While a pitchfork was used in Anne's case too, that's where the similarities between both cases end. A man named James Haywood killed Anne in front of several witnesses after claiming she was a witch. A BBC reporter in 2014 claimed that they had faced a community response when asking Lower Quinton residents about Charles's case. They noticed that the villagers were tight-lipped. The landlord of the College Arms, the pub where Potter had been drinking on the morning of February 14th, 1945, told the reporter, quote, "Talking about it would just upset people, and there's no sense in alienating people in a small village like this." He also added, "In cases like this, there's always someone that knows something. Someone knows what happens, but for the sake of relatives and for not upsetting people, no one will say." In 1960, Charles's missing pocket watch was located in his outhouse, which had been thoroughly searched in the weeks following his death, leading police to believe that the perpetrator had returned it for unknown reasons. As of today, the gruesome murder of Charles Walton continues to go unsolved. Carla Rodriguez. Carla Carolina Rodriguez was born on September 29, 1992. Her parents were described by local news outlets as busy but loving, and they lived in a neighborhood in Las Vegas that was generally friendly, with Carla having several friends in the area nearby. On October 20th, 1999, 7-year-old Carla was walked partway to school by her mother, Elia, until they met with some of Carla's classmates. The pair parted ways then, with Carla's mother returning home so she could rest before she started work later that day. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, Carla's father returned home. He didn't see Carla, but her bike was there. Her older sister told him that, quote, "She's around here somewhere." However, Carla's father, Raman, couldn't stay as he had another meeting, and so he headed off again before returning once more at 5 p.m. Both Carla and her bike were no longer at home. Raman was not disturbed by this, as Carla had taken to cycling in the neighborhood on her own. So he took the family car to his wife's workplace, dropped it off, and took the public bus back home. At around 7 p.m, Carla was seen on her bike on the 800 block of Bonita Avenue, just 2 blocks from the family home. She apparently visited a neighbor's house, asking his son to come out to play, but the neighbor responded that it was late and it was getting dark, and told Carla she should go home. But Carla didn't leave right away, playing alone for 15 minutes outside the house before heading off. However, Carla never came home. Raman spoke to the neighbor at around 10 p.m, who relayed all the information to him. For some reason, he assumed that his daughter had gone to stay at a friend's house, and instead of looking for her, Raman decided to go home and go to bed. He apparently did not alert his wife to this information, as he didn't want to worry her. The next morning, Elia headed to Carla's school to find out if she was there. She wasn't, and she reportedly hadn't attended any of her classes the previous day. The principal alerted the police to the 7-year-old's sudden disappearance. Over the next several weeks, over 100 volunteers and police officers searched for the missing girl, but investigators found the situation to be grim. About 12 hours of Carla's day was unaccounted for, between when she was walking to school and when she went to the neighbor's home that evening. The fact that she wasn't reported missing right away also impeded the inquiry, as authorities had lost out on precious time. Carla's bike was located near the neighbor's house, where she was seen the night before, but there was no trace of the 7-year-old, despite the fact that searchers had meticulously combed the neighborhood and beyond. The local neighborhood was canvassed, leading to tips and leads, but none of them panned out. Over a 2-month period, law enforcement interviewed dozens of people who may have had contact with or seen the little girl, and it was noted that no one, including the family, failed any polygraph tests. The day after Carla went missing, police brought in 2 bloodhounds who traced her scent to an apartment complex on the 1700 block of Santa Paula Drive, about half a mile away from the family home. However, no evidence linked to the 7-year-old's vanishing was ever recovered from the building. Little else is known about the actual investigation into the disappearance, although reportedly hundreds of leads were followed and ruled out. The Rodriguez family had DNA taken in case any remains were ever found that could possibly be Carla's. The detective in charge of the case in 2013, Dan Holley, who was a veteran on the police force, acknowledged that it was odd that Carla's parents went to bed without reporting her missing, or even looking for her themselves. However, he did also state that this angle has been thoroughly explored. However, detectives more recently added that they were unsure if Elia ever walked her daughter to school at all that morning. It was also noted by several local papers that it appeared as if nobody consistently looked after Carla. Theories on what happened to her are few and far between. It's been speculated that she got trapped or lost somewhere, but without her bike, she couldn't have gotten far, and thorough searches have been carried out in her neighborhood and beyond. For a while, during the initial investigation, it was suspected that the 7-year-old's disappearance was connected to the debts that her parents owed a former brother-in-law. A few months prior to Carla going missing, the unidentified in-law had shown up in Vegas to demand repayment. The family gave him $1,000, but he told them this was only interest and he wanted more. Police theorized that he captured Carla so he could extort money from her parents, but in recent years this idea has been ruled out, and the brother-in-law is no longer considered a suspect. Now, authorities believe that Carla's case is a non-family abduction. Retired Deputy Chief Al Salinas described Carla as a, quote, victim waiting to happen. Despite America's Most Wanted airing segments on the case, Carla's disappearance received very little media coverage, leading to a lack of leads for investigators to follow. The investigation is still active, however. An article from 2019 stated that there is forensic evidence to be tested, although it's unknown what this evidence is. In 2020, the case was submitted for genetic genealogy testing. Police aren't looking for a suspect, but for any trace of Carla, who would be 27 years old now, or any children she may have if she is or was still alive. In the 2 decades since her disappearance, Elia and Ramon Rodriguez have had another child, a son who is now in his teens. The couple have held on to Carla's belongings and clothing, and the family made an appeal to the public in October of last year. Carla's big sister, Rosie, who was 15 when she went missing, has publicly stated that the family believe Carla is still out there, and they will continue to hope until they are proven otherwise. The FBI is offering a $5,000 reward for any information leading to Carla's whereabouts. Anyone with information on Carla's case can contact the Las Vegas FBI office at 702-385-1281 or the Metro Homicide Detectives at 702-828-3521. Sonny Liston. Born in rural Arkansas around 1930, Charles L. Sonny Liston was the 24th of an incredible 25 children. Since birth certificates were not legally required, it is unknown exactly what Sonny's birthday is, although some have speculated that at the time of his death in 1970, he was closer to 50 years of age than 40. Sonny had a grim upbringing. He was beaten at home and struggled in school, illiterate even in his adult years. As a result, he turned to a life of crime early on, and went on to begin a professional boxing career in 1953 after a brief 2-year stint in jail. It wasn't long, however, before the mob acclaimed Sonny as one of their own, managing every single one of his fights and controlling every cent he earned. For a time, Sonny worked for a mob boss as an enforcer, while in his early days as a professional boxer, he was managed by Frank Blinky Palamo, an associate of the infamous mafia hitman Frankie Carbo. However, Sonny's professional career was remarkable. He became the world heavyweight champion after knocking out Floyd Patterson in 1962 and again in 1963. In the world of boxing, he was well known for his formidable punching power and his towering, intimidating appearance. Then, in 1964, Sonny lost his title to Muhammad Ali in 2 matches which were considered extremely controversial in the sporting world, as rumours swirled that the matches had been fixed. In the rematch, Sonny had gone down just 104 seconds into the fight, having been hit by a quote, phantom punch that very few people saw. Even Muhammad Ali was furious. The odd circumstances surrounding Sonny's defeat led even his own wife to believe that he'd purposefully thrown the match. On January 5th, 1971, Sonny's wife, Geraldine, came home from a 2-week trip in which she had been visiting her mother for Christmas with her 7-year-old son. Upon entering the couple's residence in Paradise Palms, a mostly white, wealthy suburb in Las Vegas, Geraldine was hit by a nauseating smell, which emanated from the bedroom. There, on the bed, was the bloated body of her husband. There was a broken footbench on the floor. Geraldine first notified her lawyer, then her husband's doctor. She didn't notify police for 2 to 3 hours. When authorities were called, however, they quickly determined there was no foul play. At first, it was theorized that Sonny had fallen backwards while undressing, which led to the broken rail on the footbench, but they later decided that he had died from a heroin overdose. Investigating officer Sergeant Caputo was one of the first on the scene and found a 1/4 ounce of heroin in a balloon in the kitchen and 1/2 ounce of marijuana in the pocket of Sonny's trousers. No needles were found, nor any other kind of drug paraphernalia, however. Caputo said, quote, "It was common knowledge that Sonny was a heroin addict." Except to those who knew him, it was not common knowledge at all. Friends and family testified that the former heavyweight champion was deathly afraid of needles, to the point that he cancelled a trip to Africa because he refused to get the vaccinations he needed to enter the country. Both his dentist and his wife backed up these claims, among others. The coroner who investigated the death noted that although morphine was found in his system, produced by the body's breakdown of heroin, there was not enough that it could be considered a lethal dose. While there was scar tissue at the bend of Sonny's elbow, one of his friends speculated that this could have been from a shot he was given while in hospital after a car accident, shortly before his death. Officially, Sonny's cause of death was listed as heart failure. He had been hospitalized in early December after suffering chest pains. There was no other bodily wounds or weapons located. His official date of death was December 30th, 1970. This was determined by the newspapers and milk bottles lying around the property. Sonny's boxing trainer, Johnny Toko, claimed that on January 1st, Geraldine phoned him because she hadn't heard from her husband in 3 days and was concerned. Toko allegedly told a friend that he went to the residence that day and found the door locked and Sonny's car in the driveway, so he phoned the police who came and broke down the door. The house did not have any foul smells yet, but Sonny's body was found in the bedroom with a needle sticking out of his arm. According to Toko, the police knew of the boxer's demise before Geraldine called them 4 days later, but they left his body there anyway. It has been speculated that Geraldine spent the time in between finding Sonny's body and calling the police tidying up the crime scene by perhaps getting rid of any syringes. But if Sonny's drug habit was well known, as the police have made out, then why would she have to clear up anything? On the whole, Sonny did not have a great reputation either, so it seems unlikely that a death by overdose would have made anyone think any differently of him. Although the verdict has been given and makes sense to some, many still believe that Sonny's demise was not an accident, with many believing he suffered his fate at the hands of the mob. Sonny's publicist, a man named Harold Conrad, plus others who knew the boxer, stated that he had been deeply involved as a bill collector of a loan sharking ring in Las Vegas. It is speculated that Sonny tried to muscle in for a bigger slice of the pie, and was murdered instead, being stuck with a lethal dose of heroin. Meanwhile, a professional gambler named Lem Banker insisted that Sonny had been killed by drug dealers who thought that he had ratted them out. The main fact which fuels the fire of speculation, however, is Sonny's mob ties. He was known to have had them since the beginning of his career. In fact, he was largely disliked as a sportsman by the general public because of his criminal past and continued links with organised crime. Some theorized that Sonny was supposed to throw the fight against Chuck Wepner, the inspiration behind the Rocky franchise, 6 months before his death, and when he didn't, he was taken out in retaliation. Others have wondered if he was due money for possibly throwing the Muhammad Ali fight, but that he was never paid, and so he threatened to go public with what he knew, and as a result, the mob made sure he met his end. It's been proposed that maybe Sonny was slain because he was simply no longer profitable. It was also rumoured that he did not show enough respect to a certain mob boss, and that he refused to do something they wanted, and as a result, his life was taken from him. A 2013 book by a man named Greg Swaim claimed that his late father, James John Wojak, the mob hitman with links to Frank Sinatra and Mickey Cohen, admitted to helping kill Sonny via an enforced heroin overdose. Even to this day, Sonny Liston's cause of death is still widely debated. Star Palumbo. Star Michelle Palumbo was born on March 19, 1975, and her disappearance in the year 2000 is one of the strangest in Nevada's history. Shortly after 12 AM on April 26, 2000, Star was seen wandering around a restricted area of the Reno International Airport. She appeared to be disoriented and frightened. An airport officer shortly arrived on the scene and located her hiding behind a truck. When spoken to, Star told the officer that she was looking for her younger sister, who was running loose on the tarmac, despite the fact that the 25-year-old had no such sibling. Although the officer did not believe her and suspected that she was hallucinating, he didn't feel she was a danger to anyone or had harmful intentions, so when she asked for a ride, he obliged. Star was dropped off at the Reno Hilton Hotel and Casino at around 1:30 AM. This is the last known sighting of Star. The following day, a car was found parked illegally at the airport. Upon running the plates, it was found that the car belonged to the same Star Palumbo who'd been caught in the restricted airport area the day before. The car was filled to the brim with belongings, suggesting that Star had been living in it for quite some time. Located inside were her mobile phone, handbag, $600 in cash, and, most curiously, copies of 3 different emails she had sent to the White House. The emails indicated that she believed the US government was trying to kill her. Not only this, but the 25-year-old had 2 books on how to change one's identity. Also found inside the car was a drawing of a woman, bound and gagged, which investigators claim was her. However, there is no full image of the drawing online, and it is in black and white and has a cartoonish style, making many wonder how exactly authorities came to this conclusion. Starr never returned to claim her car, and there was nothing inside to indicate where she was or what exactly had happened to her, although authorities found a phone book inside filled with the names of men, and suspected that she'd become involved with sex work, a job that is, obviously, not without its dangers. Starr's mother, Gail, described her daughter as happy, sociable, trusting, and dependable. She had a happy childhood and moved the year before from her hometown in Arizona to Reno, Nevada. For a time, Starr was living with her grandmother, but at the time of her disappearance, she had moved out. Her grandmother reported her missing a week after the incident at the airport. According to Gail, Starr had fallen in with a bad crowd and had become involved with the drugs scene, methamphetamines in particular. She had been working as a cashier at a pawn shop but didn't make enough money to feed her drug habit. According to several articles, she was unemployed at the time she went missing. She also had several convictions in 1995 and 1998 for petty crimes. Although she lived far from home, Starr called her mother every week. During their last call together, on the 25th of April, Gail reported that her daughter sounded anxious and paranoid, claiming that her phone was tapped and that someone was listening in. She also expressed fears that she was being followed. Starr mentioned that something was happening that made her afraid for her life, but she refused to elaborate any further. Perhaps most tragically is that, in that final call, Starr mentioned that she wanted to come back to Arizona to get a fresh start and to turn her life around. After her grandmother reported her missing, the local police department launched a search for the 25-year-old, distributing her photo throughout Nevada, but their efforts proved fruitless. The only lead police received was when the owner of the Silver Dollar Casino in Elko, a woman named Linda Fields, came forward to say that she'd seen Starr in December of 2000. Reportedly, Starr looked afraid and was by herself. She told Linda that her name was Starr and that she was either being chased or trying to escape her pimp. She appeared anxious and upset when she noticed a man looking through the bar window at her, and she quickly left with another young woman. There are no other publicly known sightings of Starr Palumbo. There were some unsubstantiated rumors that the 25-year-old had overdosed and that her body had been dumped in the desert, although their origin is unknown. Her friends, on the other hand, believe she was trying to change her identity to hide from the people to whom she owed drug money. It's unknown if any specific dealers have been questioned or are considered suspects. One newspaper reported that her friends and acquaintances often told different, conflicting stories, hindering the police investigation further. Sadly, the case of Starr Palumbo remains unsolved and appears to have been largely forgotten about by the mainstream media, although the case was featured on Unsolved Mysteries in October of 2001. Authorities believe Starr is either suffering an organic or drug-induced psychosis, and is a woman who doesn't know where or who she is. The other possibility is that she's the victim of a serious crime and is either unable to contact her family or has tragically been killed. If Starr is still alive today, she would be 45 years old. Anyone with any information on Starr's case can contact the Reno PD at 775-334-2175. Rihanna Burrow. Born February 7th, 1980, Rihanna Burrow was described by her teachers as a cooperative and friendly girl with an infectious smile. She was a high-achieving student who was expected to go far in life, and she had a small, close-knit group of friends. Tragically, however, all that changed in 1992. In October of that year, Rihanna, now 12 years old, was living with her mother and brother in a home on Wakefield Avenue in Morford Vale, a busy suburb of South Australia. On the day of October 7th, Rihanna initially planned to travel 5 kilometers away to a shopping centre to have lunch with her mother, Paula, who was studying at the adjacent college. However, on this particular day, the public bus drivers went on strike, leaving Rihanna with no way to travel to meet her mother. Although she couldn't carry out her regular plans, the 12-year-old arranged with her mother to walk to a nearby newsagent for a Christmas card for her pen pal. Although it was only October, the international postage to America would mean that the card would take some time to arrive at the other end. At around 10:30 AM, Rihanna walked away from her home. She purchased the card at 11:19 AM at Ranelagh Shopping Centre and was later seen at around 2:30 PM at Morford Vale High School, a route which she used as a shortcut between her home and the newsagent. After this, Rihanna's movements are unclear. At around 4:10 PM, her mother Paula came home. She found the front door of the house locked and noticed that the TV was on. A vinyl record was strewn on the floor of the living room, as if her daughter had been playing it. The Christmas card, purchased for Rihanna's American pen pal, was lying on the table, still in its carrier bag. The young girl herself, however, was nowhere to be seen. Immediately concerned, Paula began to call round Rihanna's friends and family members to see if anyone had seen her, and she also started knocking on the doors of neighbours to find out if they knew where her daughter was. But each time, Paula drew a blank. By 6 PM, she had phoned the police. Although the authorities did not take the case lightly, they had precious little to go on. Paula made several appeals to the public, asking for help in locating her daughter, while Rihanna's father, Leon, flew from his home in Queensland to help with the search. Rihanna's brother could not provide any clues to the investigation, given that he had not been home at all that day. It wasn't long before police began to theorize that Rihanna had been taken from her home. It was believed that the 12-year-old had made it back to her house, but was approached by someone who'd come to the door. None of her personal belongings were missing, suggesting that Rihanna had not intended on leaving again after returning from the newsagents, or perhaps that she had left in a rush. As a result of the number of public appeals organized by law enforcement, by November 25th, authorities had received over 1,600 tips. In one day alone, they received as many as 140. The hopes of those invested in the case raised when one of the tips pointed to a sighting of a girl on Acre Avenue who resembled the missing 12-year-old. But it was sadly established the girl was not Rihanna and had nothing to do with the case. Rubbish dumps were searched, and exploration of the bushland around the area turned up no new leads. Several tips that were called into the police were determined to be hoaxes, and many more led to dead ends. One tip-off even led police to believe that Rihanna was being held hostage in an apartment block on Anzac Highway in Coralta Park. Police raided the building, but found no sign of her, leading to an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness for all those involved in the case. Another sighting was that of a white car with Victorian license plates, which was seen in the area and had been reported to law enforcement. However, it was never found, and this line of inquiry has since been abandoned. According to a 2012 article, Rihanna's family were contacted by authorities who had narrowed down their suspect pool. At the time, the police were investigating at least one person who knew the young girl but was not related to her. It's unknown exactly what became of this lead, but since Rihanna's abductor continues to go free, it seems unlikely that it panned out. One local paper, named The Advertiser, printed a story that detailed how a man found a set of keys on Highway Drive, just a few hundred meters from Rihanna's home. The keys matched the description of those the young girl was thought to have on her at the time of her disappearance. The unidentified man called police from a payphone across the road. However, he claimed that when he returned to the scene, the keys were gone. According to authorities, who were later asked about this detail, the man had gone to the scene over a month after Rihanna's disappearance because his conscience was bothering him. On the afternoon of October 7th, the man had apparently seen a girl matching Rihanna's description near a white car in the same location where he'd discovered her keys. While this seemed like a promising lead, it appears that nothing more has come from it, and Rihanna's keys have never been recovered. Although there is little to go on, many online sleuths have offered up theories in regards to Rihanna's case. One Reddit user wondered why the 12-year-old had spent so long at the shops, and speculated that she may have met someone, or perhaps stopped for lunch and unknowingly caught the attention of the perpetrator. Others have postulated that since the door was locked and there were no signs of a struggle, Rihanna must have gone willingly, likely with someone that she knew. The final theory, often discussed, is about the potential link between Rihanna's case and the unidentified serial rapist Mr. Cruel, who attacked multiple young girls in the 80s and 90s in Victoria. Mr. Cruel's known cases have similarities to that of Rihanna's. For one, the 12-year-old fits the age range of his victims, and he only attacked during the school holidays, and October the 7th, 1992 was a holiday. Mr. Cruel was also known to be from the Victoria area, and the car linked with Rihanna's disappearance was the white car with Victoria plates. Many have wondered if Mr. Cruel left Victoria since local police were throwing so much time and effort into trying to apprehend him. A concrete connection between Rihanna and Mr. Cruel, however, has never been made. A month after Rihanna's disappearance, a reward of $100,000 was raised for anyone who could provide information leading to either a conviction in the case or the young girl's remains. This reward has since been upped to $1 million. Anyone with any information on the disappearance of Rihanna is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Sarah McDermid. Born in the Scottish Highlands on November 15, 1966, Sarah McDermid was 20 years old when she joined her family, including her parents Peter and Sheila, in emigrating to Australia in 1987. Described as a young woman who loved music and clothes and who embraced her mixed heritage, Sarah was well liked, had a solid group of friends, and a great relationship with her family. She was particularly close to her brother, Alistair. However, what was supposed to be a fresh start for the family turned into a tragic nightmare, with Sarah's disappearance in 1990. On the morning of July 11th, 1990, at around 7:20 a.m., 23-year-old Sarah left her home on Skye Road, Frankston, to head to work as usual. She was dressed in a grey suit and had in her possession a bag containing sports clothing, a tennis racket, $60 in cash, and a Walkman. After a busy day, Sarah left her workplace at 5:10 p.m. and joined her friends for a few games of tennis at what was then known as Flinders Park in Batman Avenue, East Melbourne. After the game, Sarah, along with her friends, headed to Richmond Station, where they found they'd just missed the Frankston Line train. Instead, the group got a train to Caulfield before changing to the Frankston service. The two friends who had been with her disembarked at Bonbeach, while Sarah continued to the Kananook railway station where she'd left her car that morning. The last time the 23-year-old was seen was when she got off the train and headed for the poorly lit car park at approximately 10:20 p.m. When Sarah didn't come home by 1 a.m, her family grew concerned. They sent one of her brothers, Ian, to look for her at the station. Her car, a red 1978 Honda Civic, remained still locked, but Sarah was missing. Despite this alarm, the young woman was not called in as a missing person until the following morning, when her family found out that she had gotten on the train home and that she hadn't turned up to work that morning. They had hoped that possibly she had stayed at a friend's the night prior. Authorities were sent to investigate Sarah's car and were disturbed when they found bloodstains beside it. They immediately suspected that the 23-year-old had been assaulted due to the amount of blood they had uncovered. Forensics later confirmed that this blood belonged to Sarah. They also found drag marks which led into the bushes, as well as a lighter that was identified by the family as having belonged to Sarah. Soon, witnesses came forward. They had seen the young woman step off the train and head across the footbridge to the car park, where several people had heard a young woman scream, "Give me back my keys." Another variation of this quote has been reported as, "Give me my car keys and stop fooling around." A sea, air and land search lasting 21 days took place, utilising 250 police officers, but this attempt to gather clues proved fruitless. One detective sergeant stated his belief that the attack on Sarah had been opportunistic, and her father Peter, agreed with this statement. Since she always wore expensive-looking clothes, it's been theorized that she was perhaps attacked for any money or valuables she may have had on her. After this, however, Sarah's case begins to grow cold. In May of 2006, an inquest returned the verdict that she'd met foul play, but the exact circumstances are unknown. 5 years later, in 2011, convicted serial killer Paula Denia, who killed 3 young women in 1993 and had previously gone by the name of Paul before identifying as a transgender woman, was interviewed by police. However, she denied any involvement with Sarah's disappearance. It's been noted that although Denia's second victim lived near to the station where Sarah went missing, her MO does not match. Denia confessed to her crimes and did not hide the body of her victims. Then, in May of 2014, News Corp Australia claimed that police investigators were considering convicted serial killer Bandali Debs as a possible suspect. In 1997, Debs took the life of a teenager named Kirsty Harty, and in 1998, he executed 2 police officers. According to the media company Fairfax Media, a senior police source noted it was common practice for homicide investigators to examine links between unsolved cases and known offenders. Debs also denies any involvement in Sarah's case. In September of 2004, the 23-year-old's case was featured on the Australian psychic TV show called Sensing Murder. In the program, several psychics claimed that Sarah was dead and her body had been thrown into a now closed rubbish dump on Mornington Peninsula. This program led to a former Frankston resident becoming inspired, and he scoured the area on his bike, finding what he thought to be 2 shallow graves. When he contacted the police about this find, he was asked to dig it up, and the man refused, worried that he would incriminate himself if he did so. The 2 potential graves have not been looked into since, and authorities are, naturally, dismissive of theories that are offered up without evidence by so-called psychic sources. The main police theory, and perhaps the most compelling one, involved a sex worker named Jody Jones. Prior to Sarah's disappearance, Jones had been sentenced to 12 years after being convicted of manslaughter when she'd jumped on a man's chest while wearing stilettos. Despite this and a list of prior crimes, she was let out early. Police theorized that Jones had led several homeless drug addicts to jump Sarah as she approached her car, and that the group stole the 23-year-old's bag and stabbed her in the back. On July 23rd, just 12 days after Sarah's disappearance, police pulled Jones in for questioning. Several of her friends had stated that she had confessed to slaying the young woman along with 2 men, and that she was worried they would go to the police. Jody Jones died 14 months later from a heroin overdose, aged 26 years old. If Jones was involved in any way, it seems likely that we will never know. In the years following Sarah's disappearance, her family left the Frankston area due to having items thrown in their front garden and their car graffitied. A memorial has since been established at the Kananook railway station, and Sarah's family frequently return to place wreaths. There is a reward of $1 million available for anyone who can provide information leading to a conviction in Sarah's case or to her remains. Anyone with information on the disappearance of Sarah McDermott is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Jaden Lesky. Jaden Raymond Lesky was born on April 30th, 1996 to Belinda Williams and Brett Lesky in Newborough, Victoria. Jaden, who was just 1 year old, was last seen alive by his mother's boyfriend, a man named Greg Domasevich, who was a self-taught mechanic. The couple had reached a place in their relationship where Belinda felt comfortable leaving the 2 alone together, and Greg frequently asked to babysit little Jaden. On June 15th, 1997, Greg left Jaden sleeping in his home, while he went to pick up Belinda from a party that she was attending with her sister. During that time that he was gone, chaos unfolded on Greg's doorstep. During the course of Greg's relationship with Belinda, he'd actually been seeing his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Yvonne. On the night in question, upon seeing him leave, Yvonne's ex-fiancé and brother went over to Greg's front windows and smashed through the glass with weapons. They attempted to throw a severed pig's head through the window, but it repeatedly bounced off the frame, and so they left it in the front garden. Afterwards, the pair left. They were quickly ruled out of the subsequent investigation into Jaden's disappearance, as they were not witnessed leaving with the 1-year-old, and also drew attention to themselves by throwing stones at teenagers and starting fights. The local police force argued that these behaviours were hardly those of kidnappers. When Greg collected Belinda, she immediately asked him where her son was. Greg casually replied that he had already told her, that Jaden was in the hospital. Belinda thought back to a phone call she'd had with her boyfriend during the party. Earlier in the night, Greg told her that Jaden had burned himself on a heater and that they were at the hospital. The young mother panicked and told her sister Katie, who waved her off, claiming it was probably one of Greg's sick jokes. Katie called Greg back, and he admitted then that it was a joke. The siblings thought nothing more of it. In the car, on their way home from the party, Belinda told her boyfriend that she wanted to go and see Jaden. However, Greg had already presented her with another drink when she'd gotten into the vehicle and told her that she was too drunk and she would look like a bad mother, so he dropped her off at her home at around 3:20 AM, at which point the couple witnessed the vandalism that had taken place at Greg's house. Greg left almost immediately after dropping his girlfriend off, claiming that he had to go and find out who destroyed his front windows. But it was later found that Greg had called Yvonne at 3:09 AM and screamed at her. During Greg's trip back to the house, he was pulled over by police for a license check and a breathalyzer test. He did not mention the pig's head or that Jaden was missing. A few hours later, at 5 AM, he woke Belinda, who'd fallen asleep in front of her heater, and told her that he had lied, and that Jaden had been kidnapped, and they would have to call the police. During police interviews, Greg repeatedly pointed the finger at his ex, Yvonne, and claimed that he hadn't reported Jaden as missing sooner because he did not trust law enforcement, and said Yvonne was sleeping with a senior officer. The search for Jaden is believed to have been the largest since the disappearance of Prime Minister Harold Holt in 1967. The 1-year-old's body was eventually found on January 1st, 1998 at Blue Rock Dam, 18 kilometers north of the town of Moe, where he lived. His body was battered and had been weighted down with a crowbar and shrouded in a sleeping bag. He had a fractured skull and 2 broken bones in his arms, which had been inexpertly bandaged. The bag Belinda had packed for him, which contained toys and snacks, was also recovered. Due to the state of decomposition, Jaden's cause of death could not be established, although he is thought to have passed away from a head injury. His autopsy revealed that he had benzexol in his system, something which is used to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, among other illnesses. While it's believed that the 1-year-old was drugged with this before his demise, it cannot be determined when exactly this occurred. Symptoms of the drug range from dizziness and nausea to hallucinations. The forensic evidence found on Jaden's clothing was contaminated with that of an unrelated case, adding another layer of questions to a case that already struggled to provide answers. Despite the fact that Jaden's body had finally been found, the exact series of events has continued to elude investigators even today. In 1998, Greg was charged with the murder of the little boy, but he was acquitted due to lack of evidence in December that year. A 2006 inquest, which Greg's lawyer insists was driven entirely by the media outcry, found that he had contributed to Jaden's demise and that he likely disposed of the body. Greg is noted to have spent several hours of the night in question unaccounted for. Belinda recalls that she repeatedly tried to call him at one point but couldn't get through. He has also provided conflicting details, struggling to explain the night's events to investigators. Friends and family told law enforcement that Greg often locked Jaden out with the dogs, ignoring his cries, and Belinda confirmed that her son sometimes came home with bumps and bruises, but that she thought he had just fallen over, and had not assumed anything more malicious. At the time of Greg's arrest, he still had wet clothing on. His wallet was also wet, as was some of the banknotes that it contained. This has led many to suspect that it was perhaps only hours beforehand that he'd been disposing of Jaden's body. One inmate of Greg's claimed that he had confessed, telling him a jacked-up car fell onto Jaden, resulting in accidental injuries, but this inmate's confession was deemed to be inadmissible in court. It's also been reported that he confessed to the accidental death to acquaintances of his, but this information has still not led to another arrest. There are virtually no theories about Jaden's demise circling around online communities outside of Greg's involvement. However, whether he did it accidentally or on purpose depends on who is asked the question. Due to double jeopardy laws that exist in Victoria, the case has been unable to move forward. Belinda has since joined a coalition asking for law reforms and repeatedly calls for change and for a $1 million award to be made available. Belinda has since remarried and has gone on to have 4 children with her new husband. Greg has reportedly also become a father. He continues to maintain his innocence, but allegedly blames himself for leaving Jaden home alone. Although it seems almost certain Greg was responsible, the case remains open and officially unsolved. Once again, anyone with any information pertaining to Jaden's case is encouraged to contact Crime Stoppers at 1-800-333-000. Jacqueline de Wallaby. On May 17, 1981, Cynthia de Wallaby welcomed her little girl, Jacqueline Marie, into the world. Warm, kind, and loving, Jacqueline was the centre of her mother's world, and the loved stepdaughter of her mother's second husband. Unfortunately, David and Cynthia's chance to see Jacqueline grow and blossom into an adult was cut short when she was brutally murdered in 1988. On the morning of September 10th, 1988, David de Wallaby and his son woke early, trying not to wake the family members who slumbered throughout the house. David noticed the front door was partially open at around 7:15 a.m, but assumed that it was his mother who lived in the basement. Her car wasn't in the drive, so he was satisfied that she had likely left the door open when she was going out. 2 hours later, when Cynthia awoke, she headed into Jacqueline's room to wake her for the day. But Jacqueline wasn't in her bed. Her duvet was gone too. Frantic, Cynthia searched the home, while her husband and son gathered friends and went to search for Jacqueline in the neighbourhood, assuming she must have headed out early to play with friends. But no signs of Jacqueline arose, despite the search efforts of family and friends. While Cynthia went to a neighbour's house, she noted that a window leading into the basement had been broken. It appeared someone had broken into the house in the middle of the night without the family noticing. The de Wallabys soon alerted authorities. Police and the FBI waited for a ransom call to come, as it seemed like whoever had broken into the home had taken Jacqueline. But the call never came, and family and friends prayed for the return of the 7-year-old girl. For 5 days, desperate search parties turned up no evidence of Jacqueline or her potential kidnapper. However, on September 14th, the little girl's body was found in a vacant field near Blue Island, Illinois, 6 miles from her home. Her comforter and nightdress were found with her, and there was a rope around her neck. Investigators who took on the murder case of Jacqueline de Wallaby focused on 2 theories. The first was that she'd been randomly kidnapped by a stranger. The second was that Jacqueline was a victim of her own parents, who'd killed her for an unknown reason. David and Cynthia were questioned about what the couple had done in the morning of the 10th, and authorities suspected that the basement window had been broken from the inside to make it look like an intruder had entered the home. The windowsill still had dust on it, none of which had been shifted. None of the items below the window had been disturbed either. A few days before Jacqueline was found, on September 11th, David de Wallaby was subjected to a polygraph test, which he passed. On the day that Jacqueline's body was discovered, he was asked to take another, the results of which were inconclusive. I mention this only to detail the events of the investigation. It is important to note that polygraph tests are not really lie detector tests, and they are certainly not foolproof. Most courts don't allow them into evidence. All in all, they offer us very little to go on. However, these tests were a little more interesting than normal. According to David, the examiner performing the test told him to say yes to every question, but David refused to say it when he was asked if he had killed Jacqueline. He went on to endure 5 more hours of interrogation before an officer interrupted to say that the 7-year-old's body had been found. Initially, David thought they were lying, trying to force a confession from him, but he later found out they were telling the truth. Jacqueline was laid to rest on September 17th. Soon, the investigation into a random kidnapping fell away, and authorities focused their investigation on Cynthia and David. The Illinois State Police Department, along with the Blue Island Police, all worked together to build a case against the couple, and in November of 1988, the pair were arrested and charged. Cynthia was 2 months pregnant at the time. In April of 1990, Cynthia and David DeWallaby went on trial. Much of the evidence against the couple was circumstantial, and no concrete forensic evidence tied the pair to the murder. In fact, one piece of forensic evidence proved the basement window had been broken from the outside after all, although this was not enough to clear the couple either. One eyewitness to the prosecution provided a statement which said that he had seen a man resembling David, he had a similar prominent nose, sitting in a parked car near to where the body was found. The defense pointed out that the witness had been about 75 meters away from David at the time he saw him, and that it had been a dark, moonless night. It was also found that the witness had picked David out of a lineup of front-facing pictures, while that same witness had supposedly seen David from the side. David's photograph was also bigger than the others shown. The witness could also only describe the car as dark, although at the time, the couple had a light blue vehicle. Also, before the trial had begun, 2 other witnesses had come forward to claim that Cynthia's car was seen near the dump site, but this report was later dismissed as Cynthia's car was proven to have been outside her home at the time witnesses saw it at the location. Outside of some dubious eyewitness reports, the prosecution presented other circumstantial evidence. A bloody pillow found in Jacqueline's room, her brother stating that she was, quote, spanked a lot by their parents, head hairs similar to Jacqueline's found in her parents' trunk, and a neighbour identifying the rope that was found around her neck as one that her brother often played with. However, the blood on the pillow could not be identified, and their hairs found in the trunk could not be confirmed as being Jacqueline's. Meanwhile, the defense focused on a possible suspect in the case, a convicted sex offender named Perry Hernandez, who was known to have committed a similar abduction. However, Perry's DNA was tested against that which was found on Jacqueline's body, and he was later cleared. During the trial, neither of the DeWallabys testified in their own defense. Eventually, a judge dismissed Cynthia's case as there was simply not enough evidence to put the case in front of a jury. However, David's case was allowed to go ahead. A jury deliberated for 3 days before finding him guilty of first-degree murder. He was handed a 45-year sentence. Friends and family, led by Cynthia, started a movement to try and free David, which caught the attention of a journalist who in turn criticized the conviction on multiple different occasions. In October of 1991, the Illinois Court of Appeals reversed the conviction, and David was released. A year later, in 1992, an episode of Unsolved Mysteries featured the case. This led to 2 viewers coming forward to refute the alibi given by Timothy Guess, who was David's brother and Jacqueline's uncle. Timothy was a schizophrenic and claimed to have been working that night, but restaurant workers disputed these claims, although at first they had backed his alibi as they thought Cynthia and David were guilty. Timothy had links to the apartment block next to the vacant field where Jacqueline's body was found. According to one source, Timothy had previously been accused of trying to kidnap his niece, although this isn't widely stated and should not be taken as 100% credible. One journalist claimed that Timothy had told him that a spirit lived inside him and told him the details of the murder. He knew the layout of the family home, despite the fact he had never been in it before. He was also aware of the fact that a light was on in Jacqueline's closet that night, but not in her bedroom. This specific detail pertaining to Jacqueline's case was never released to the public. Despite this evidence against Timothy Guess, he was never charged and passed away in 2002. Due to the publicity and notoriety of the case, David and Cynthia DeWallaby have since changed their surname. They have also moved away from Illinois. But the memory they leave behind, the case of Jacqueline Marie DeWallaby, remains, to this day, unsolved. Stephanie Crowe. On the morning of January 21st, 1998, the family of 12-year-old Stephanie Crowe was shocked and distraught when they found her dead on the floor of her bedroom. She had tried to run for help, but had died on her doorway. The young girl, who lived in Escondido, California, with her grandmother, parents, younger sister, older brother, and family dog, had been stabbed 9 times. There were no signs of forced entry into the house, and while Stephanie's window was unlocked, the screen was still in place. The surrounding grime and dust had not been disturbed. The sliding doors in the bedroom of Stephanie's parents were found to be unlocked. However, any intruder would have had to sneak past the two without waking them, which seems unlikely. There were no knives anywhere in the home which matched the wounds made on Stephanie's body, and no bloody clothing could be found. Later, it was found that the Crowe family had a habit of leaving the laundry room door unlocked, a door which they used as their main entrance. To authorities, it seemed quite possible that someone in the family was responsible for the grim murder of a 12-year-old girl, and so the family were questioned extensively. Their clothing was confiscated and their bodies were examined for injuries. Stephanie's parents were put up in a motel, while the 2 children were taken into protective custody at the Polinsky Children's Center. The children were not allowed to see their parents for several days, and the police began to interview them without the knowledge of their guardians. Stephanie's older brother, Michael Crowe, who was just 14 at the time of his sister's murder, was taken to the police station several times and was considered the primary suspect by police in their investigation. They believed, due to the lack of disturbance in the house and the fact that nobody seemed to wake during the attack, that it was an inside job. According to the investigators, Michael seemed distant and preoccupied in the aftermath of the tragedy, while the remainder of the family grieved for their lost daughter and sibling. During one of the sessions in which Michael was questioned without the consent or knowledge of his parents, and even without a lawyer present, the police told Michael that they'd found physical evidence linking him with the crime, including her blood in his room, and that his hair was found in her grasp. They also claimed that he had failed a test with a truth verification device, and that his parents were convinced that he had done it. These unjust lies weighed heavily on his shoulders. At just 14 years old, Michael must have felt that the world was against him. After 6 hours of relentless questioning, he gave a vague confession to the authorities. In the so-called confession, Michael gave no details of the crime and said that he couldn't remember doing it. The only thing he gave that could resemble a motive was that he felt that his sister was more popular than him, and that he lived in her shadow. In this same taped interview, later released to the public, he can be heard saying several times over, "I'm only saying this because it's what you want to hear." Despite the blatant fact that Michael was lying and that he had been pushed into a false confession by police, the police arrested and charged the 14-year-old boy. They cited his interest in violent video games as part of what spurred him to commit the murder of his 12-year-old sister. 2 15-year-old friends of Michael's were also questioned by authorities, Joshua Treadway and Aaron Hauser. Aaron had an extensive collection of knives, one of which was reported missing by his parents. It was later found in Joshua's house, and he admitted he'd taken it from Aaron without permission. Police detained Joshua on charges of petty theft, and then questioned him continuously from 9 p.m. till 8 a.m. at their headquarters, telling him that they believed the knife he had possession of was the weapon used in the murder of Stephanie Crowe. 2 weeks later, Joshua was questioned again. During the 10-hour interview, he eventually broke down and gave a detailed confession. He said he had committed the crime with 2 other boys. Joshua was subsequently arrested. Aaron Hauser was the last one to be arrested and questioned. He refused to confess, but provided an odd, hypothetical situation on how the event might have happened, after being prompted to do so by police. All 3 boys recanted their confessions, however, claiming that they had been coerced into giving false statements. All the while, as the police bullied 3 young boys into giving confessions, a real suspect was walking the streets. On the day that Stephanie's body was found, a man named Richard Raymond Tweet was interviewed. He was 28 years old, a transient and a schizophrenic with a lengthy criminal record. On the night of the murder, Richard was seen looking into windows and knocking on doors up and down the street. Several neighbours had called the police to report him. He had scrapes on his body and a cut on his hand. However, police quickly dismissed him as a suspect in the case, believing he wasn't capable of carrying out the murder. Besides, they had already decided to pin the thing on Stephanie's 14-year-old brother, Michael, in a battery of psychological torture and bullying. Perhaps it mattered little to them to chase up real leads, if they could enjoy the sport of tormenting an isolated 14-year-old boy who was still grieving the murder of his 12-year-old sister. Michael Crow, Joshua Treadway, and Aaron Hauser were all charged with murder and conspiracy to commit murder. They were each imprisoned for 6 months as prosecutors prepared for the trial. Just as the trial was set to begin, Stephanie's blood was found on a shirt belonging to Richard Tweet, the transient man who'd been interviewed on the day of the murder. The charges against the 3 boys were dismissed. Afterwards, the Escondido police fell silent. They abandoned the case for several years without charging anybody with the murder. The case changed hands several times over the course of 2001 and 2002, and the trial against Richard Tweet finally took place in 2004. On the first day of jury selection, Richard managed to get out of the cuffs and consequently took off during a lunch break, boarding a bus. He was reapprehended just hours later, however. Once the trial was underway, the defense claimed that the blood on Richard's shirt had been contaminated by prior shoddy police work and was not real evidence. The prosecution linked Richard to both physical and circumstantial evidence, but on May 26, 2004, the jury acquitted him of murder and convicted him of voluntary manslaughter. Richard was sentenced to 13 years in prison, plus an additional 4 for his earlier attempt to flee. Richard went on to appeal his conviction, raising several claims, including that his Sixth Amendment right had been violated because he was prevented from fully cross-examining a witness for the prosecution. After much debate, a retrial was scheduled for 2013. During the trial, the prosecution could not produce any fingerprints, DNA evidence, or trace evidence on Richard's clothing, or in the house of the Crows. They claimed he had killed Stephanie in anger, because she resembled a woman he was looking for, a woman who'd turned him down a few years prior. In December of 2013, a jury found him not guilty. There was no evidence that he had ever been in the home, and they agreed with the defense that the victim's blood could have occurred via contamination. According to Richard, he had found the shirt in a dumpster. The families of Michael Crow, Aaron Hauser, and Joshua Treadway have since sued the cities of Escondido and Oceanside. And in 2012, all 3 were cleared of all charges. A judge ruled that they were factually innocent and permanently dismissed the criminal case against them. However, the murder of Stephanie Crow still remains unsolved. Jenny Lynn. 14-year-old Jenny Lynn was a clever and talented young girl who played both the piano and viola while maintaining straight A's in all her classes. She was the only daughter of 2 professionals, John and May Leanne Lynn, and resided in Castro Valley, California. On May 27, 1994, Jenny came home from school and chatted on the phone with a friend until around 5:15 p.m. This was routine for Jenny, as she was a popular and well-liked girl with many friends, and often spent hours on the phone at all times of day between homework, practicing with her musical instruments, and listening to music. At some point shortly after the call, however, Jenny was forced to undress and was stabbed repeatedly in the bathroom on the second floor of her home. She had been bound with duct tape. Her father found her body when he returned home from work at around 6:45 p.m. Authorities were immediately called to the scene. Upon first inspection of the home, police, with help from the family, found that nothing had been stolen, suggesting that the motive behind the crime was not burglary. Investigators believed that the killer entered the home via a broken window or the sliding glass door. It's believed to be possible that the killer had intended on sexually assaulting Jenny, but was interrupted in some way. Bloodhounds were utilized at the scene, and they managed to track the scent through a field behind the family's home. It's possible that this was the killer's escape route. Jenny's case only gets stranger from here, however, as John Lynn, her father, came forward with a possible clue in the investigation. He told authorities that on or around May 12, 1994, between 6 and 7:30 p.m., a man approached him at the Bay Fair BART station in San Leandro, California, and said, "I have a proposition for you. I got your daughter." John was able to provide a description of the odd man, and thus a composite sketch of him was created. The man is described as being an adult male around 30 to 45 years of age at the time in 1994. He was around 5'8" to 6 foot and thin, with gaunt features. However, the investigating authorities do not consider this man a person of interest. For over a decade, John and May Leanne Lynn waited for answers and for justice, so that they could finally begin to heal and overcome the tragedy that hit their family. Then in 2006, police named their prime suspect as Sebastian Alexander Shaw, a Vietnamese man born in 1967. Sebastian was arrested in August of 1994, where he was found with a stolen car and 2 rifles, taken from San Ramon just 3 days after Jenny's cold-blooded murder. Sebastian was also in possession of a, quote, murder kit, including surgical gloves, a ski mask, duct tape, knives, binoculars, and plastic wrist ties, like those used by police. The man already has a long criminal history, as he had already 3 murder convictions and claimed to have killed 10 to 12 people. However, although this lead in Jenny's case does look promising, there simply isn't enough evidence to link Sebastian to the crime and find a conviction. It has not been publicly stated what made police come to Sebastian as a suspect. Earlier in the investigation, the FBI thought it was likely that the perpetrator was local in the community, who knew Jenny and knew her routine. It was, for a time, speculated by online sleuths that Tommy Lynn Sells was responsible for the murder, but this theory has long since been discarded. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Jenny's parents started the Jenny Lynn Foundation, which honors the 14-year-old through community programs. The charitable organization sponsors many events in the East Bay area, such as the Youth Music Camp, scholarships for young musicians, and safety awareness education. Although her parents fight to keep her case alive, Jenny's murder remains, to this day, unsolved. Richard Horne. Richard Horne was born in Coventry in Warwickshire, England on May 9, 1960, to Derek and Josephine Horne, and spent much of his early life on a farm. He attended boarding school through his childhood and finished his education at Wrekin College in Shropshire. Richard moved to Edinburgh in 1978, where he adopted the pen name Harry Horse. Richard was a renowned children's author, known for books such as The Castaways, which earned him the Nestle Smarties Book Prize, and The Last Polar Bears, which was made into a children's cartoon. He published his first book, which featured the Loch Ness Monster, in 1983. Not only a talented writer and illustrator, Richard also performed as the singer in a Scottish bluegrass band called Swamp Trash, which formed in Edinburgh in 1987. He also fronted a band named Hexology. In 1993, he designed, created, and wrote a point-and-click adventure game called Drowned God: Conspiracy of the Ages. In 1989, while Swamp Trash performed a gig in Shetland, Richard met Mandy Williamson, a fish packer and nursing auxiliary. The couple had a whirlwind relationship and wed in 1990, having a happy marriage until Mandy became ill with multiple sclerosis. The pair moved to Shetland in 2004 so they could be closer to Mandy's parents. However, beneath Richard's illustrious career and the face he wore in public, a storm was brewing. On January 10th, 2007, Richard, 46, and his wife Mandy, 39, were found slain in their Westborough, Shetland Islands home. At first, the newspapers reported the couple's deaths as a, quote, final act of love. Mandy had been wheelchair-bound for some time and had difficulties speaking. Islanders and mainstream media assumed that Richard and his wife had entered into a suicide pact. Mandy was terminally ill, and the children's author just couldn't live without her, so they decided to go out together. That was the narrative that was sold. The details of the deaths were kept from the public for over a year, until Richard's mother eventually revealed the truth. Mandy had been stabbed by Richard over 30 times, with such viciousness that the first blade handle had broken, so he used a second to finally take Mandy's life from her. She had defensive wounds all over her arms. Next, Richard killed the family pets, a cat and a dog, before he finally turned the blade on himself. He stabbed himself 47 times, collapsing on the bed next to his wife and bleeding out. Earlier that day, friends of the couple had visited them. Reportedly, Richard was in a, quote, demented state, saying, quote, "It's a wonderful night for a killing." Mandy, frightened by her husband's words and manner, didn't want their friends to leave, but they did, for unknown reasons. When they returned the next morning at around 9:40 a.m. for a belonging they'd left behind, they found the gruesome bloodbath. Mandy's murder was the first in Shetland in over 15 years. The scene was so horrifying that the doctor who'd attended had to take time off work afterwards, traumatized by what he had seen. When the truth came out, Richard's true nature became clear to onlookers. In the months leading up to the vicious slaying, he'd cut off contact with his friends and family and had become increasingly volatile with an explosive temper. The worse Mandy's illness got, the more uncontrollable her husband's rage became. Reportedly, the children's author had described Shetland as a living hell, and asked his friends to imagine what it was like to attend the bodily functions of the woman he loved. Drug paraphernalia was found inside the house, and while Richard was a regular user of marijuana and known to take ecstasy, he'd apparently taken a cocktail of drugs on the night in question, but it is unknown what exactly he consumed. Despite the brutality of the crime, Richard is still fondly remembered by other writers, and his disturbing dark side seems to have gone largely unnoticed online. Richard Klinkhamer. Richard Klinkhamer, born on March 15, 1937 in the Netherlands, did not have the most pleasant of upbringings. As a young child, his mother engaged in an affair with an SS officer, and during the war, she was sexually assaulted by another German soldier. Upon her return to Holland, she had her head shaved by vigilante locals during an ugly carnival, and had to resort to sex work to make ends meet. As a young man, Richard enlisted and fought as a part of the French Foreign Legion, and as an author, he began to use his real-life experiences in war and petty crime to write his books. He particularly drew on his military experience when writing his first book, Obedient as a Dog, in which he told the reader that the first thing one is taught in the French Foreign Legion is to kill, and the second is how to dispose of a body. Richard's writing career neither failed nor made him a huge success. He was not well known in his home country. By the time Richard met Hanny Godfreynon, he had been divorced once already. Hanny was a pediatric nurse and was blindly infatuated with her new partner, who was 10 years her senior. Reportedly, Hanny had her own tragic past. At 9 years old, in July of 1957, she had found her mother's deceased body. Maria, 46, had been executed by Hanny's father, who had thrown her downstairs before bludgeoning her with a hammer. Richard and Hanny had a happy marriage for some time until the writer began to drink heavily, reportedly a result of the couple's financial troubles. Upon drinking heavily, Richard would physically abuse his wife. When this occurred, Hanny would flee to her friends for safety, but unfortunately, she always returned to her husband again. It was 1991 when Hanny went missing from the couple's home in Hongeridge Wolf, and when he reported his wife missing, Richard told authorities that he had found her bike at a nearby train station. According to an article in The Guardian, the couple's home was searched, dogs were utilised, infrared scanners were used, and the garden was dug up, but no evidence of the missing woman was ever found. This didn't stop police suspicions, however, especially when friends told of the domestic abuse that had taken place in the last few years. Richard was brought in for questioning several times and even detained once, but without concrete evidence, police couldn't bring charges against the writer. A year after the disappearance of his wife, Richard went to a publisher with a new manuscript, which detailed 7 ways in which he could have killed his wife. The book was called Wednesday Mince Day, and it set out various scenarios in which one might murder their spouse. One reportedly involved the killer running pieces of flesh through a meat grinder and feeding it to the pigeons. The manuscript was ultimately rejected for being too gruesome. At this time, Richard's publisher began to have his own suspicions that Richard was involved in the disappearance of his wife, but when he asked the writer, Richard apparently responded with, quote, "It's not yet the time to talk about it." In 1997, Richard sold the home he'd shared with Hanny and moved with his new girlfriend to Amsterdam. Details of the writer's gory manuscript began to leak to the underground Dutch press, and Richard began to enjoy more success than ever when he was asked to appear on some TV shows. Richard seemed hardly bothered that people thought he was involved with his wife's disappearance. In fact, he seemed to enjoy it, often answering accusations with cryptic remarks and dark jokes. Then, 3 years later, in 2000, the new occupants of the house decided to get rid of the shed in the garden. Workers who were renovating there found a human skull and skeletal remains beneath the concrete floor in the garden shed. It was the evidence that the Dutch authorities had been waiting for nearly a decade. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Hanny. On February 3rd, 2000, age 62, Richard was finally arrested for the execution of his 43-year-old wife. He hadn't reported her missing for 6 days after he'd taken her life, and told authorities that he had beaten her to death during an argument on January 31st, 1991. Afterwards, he dug a hole in the shed, dumped her body, and filled the hole with concrete. He reportedly used compost to disguise the rotting smell. While the general gist of what happened that day seems to be the same across all accounts, none of them agree on what weapon was used. Some articles state that it was a wooden bat or a handle of something, whilst others have mentioned that a crowbar or wrench was used. Regardless of what weapon was utilised, the outcome was the same. A 43-year-old woman had her life stolen by her angry, abusive husband. It's not an uncommon story, but it's one that's tragic all the same. In 2001, Richard was sentenced to just 7 years in prison. Even more disturbingly is that he was released from prison in 2003 for good behaviour. In 2007, his controversial manuscript was finally published. Even eerier yet, it seemed to bring with it a cult-like fandom, with fans of Richard creating projects on him and visiting him to get photographs, while his neighbours still considered him a, quote, good man, despite the atrocities he committed. Richard took his own life in 2016, aged 72. Liu Yongbiao. On November 29, 1995, 2 men checked into a house in Huzhou, a city in the northern Zhejiang province of China. The pair had hatched a plan to rob the other guests in the retreat. However, their plans were foiled when a guest caught the 2 stealing. So, to make sure they didn't get caught, the pair decided to commit the ultimate crime and end the man's life using clubs and hammers. However, the brutality didn't stop there. To make sure they'd covered their tracks, they proceeded to take out the guest house's owners, an elderly couple, and their 13-year-old grandson. The crime scene was carnage. What was worse for the Chinese authorities was that there was no CCTV installed at the guest house, and there was no formal guest book, meaning that law enforcement had nothing to go on. As a result, the two perpetrators escaped justice for over 2 decades. Meanwhile, a man named Liu Yongbiao became a prominent Chinese crime writer to moderate success, penning several novels in the 2000s, including his most well-known, named The Guilty Secret. In the preface to this book, he discusses the idea of writing a story about an author who gets away with committing a series of murders. He also had plans to write another book with a female protagonist called The Beautiful Woman Who Killed. He had hopes that this novel would be adopted for the big screen, and had previously had one book, a work of historical fiction, turned into a 50-episode TV series. The books themselves had won him several awards. Little did anyone know that Liu was basing these books on his own experience with several homicides. At the original crime scene in 1995, authorities had, of course, gathered evidence, including a cigarette butt. At the time, the DNA did not match anyone in any kind of law enforcement database, but the DNA was kept on file. In 2017, the authorities travelled over 15 provinces looking for suspects. They compared the DNA on file to that of data on over 60,000 people in the space of 2 months. Then, at last, their hard work paid off. The DNA matched the clan name Liu in Nanling. From here, and through meeting the clan, the police locked down Liu Yongbiao as a suspect. On August 8, 2017, 2 undercover policemen arrived at Liu's door, posing as researchers who were looking into his family tree. When they asked him for a DNA sample, he agreed. Later, Liu said he suspected the pair were cops, but felt like his time was coming to an end and he was tired of living with the guilt and the images in his head. A few days later, on August 11th, Liu Yongbiao was arrested, age 53. He had sent his wife and daughter away so they wouldn't witness him being placed in handcuffs, and had contacted his accomplice Wang Muming to tell him that the pair should face their fate. He left a letter for his wife, admitting to his crimes and telling her of his mental torment over the years. In later statements, Liu admitted that the criminals had slain the guest house lodger because, quote, he looked wealthy, but all they found on him was a watch, a ring, and the equivalent of little over $1 in cash. He also told how the bloody scenes and gruesome details had haunted him and were, quote, worse than dying, and stated that the executions had been so inhumane that he should, quote, die 100 times for committing them. Liu and Wang were found guilty of robbery and homicide in the first degree, and were sentenced to death on July 30th, 2018. Despite Liu's successful literary career, it seems unlikely that any of his remaining unpublished manuscripts will ever see the light of day. And there you have the facts. Please leave a comment down below with your own theories and speculations, and remember to like this video and subscribe to support the channel. And there you have the facts. Don't forget to check out your app by following the link below. Stay alert, stay safe, and I'll see you next time.